Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is about turning the tide, U.S. intervention in Central America. It's a book by Noam Chomsky. I've put the link, the Google Drive link that I've shared with the viewers so that you can, look and download the book and read the book for yourself. It goes through the vicious campaign of the white racist American genocidal vigilante lynchmob butchers in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and many of the Southeast Asian countries. That includes all of that stuff. So we're going to get started. Let's get started. Some background. White American vigilante lynch mob racist bestial butchers of Washington's genocidal murder campaign against the great Hispanic and great indigenous peoples of El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, as well as the great indigenous peoples of Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The white American vigilante racist lynch mob butchers of Washington and their European white racist partners participated in criminal murder and hid the massacres of the El Salvadoran and the Nicaraguan and the Guatemalan people for 50 plus years. This is similar to their murderous campaign against the great peoples of Asia. We will review today the scenes of white lynch mob racist American vigilante dictatorships in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and discuss the European and white fraud U.S. media and American academia media frauds in their coverage of these secretive white super racist politicians of Washington and their butcher campaign against these great peoples. We will discuss two presidents in detail. Jimmy Carter, the racist white American vigilante lynch mob butcher of 1976 to 1980, who enabled the Nicaraguan mass murderer Anastasia Somoza to commit genocide against the Nicaraguan peasants under the pretext of American quote-unquote human rights. These quote-unquote human rights included cutting off women's breasts after being raped, removal of the bowels of women and men, as well as their heart while alive, slitting their throats while the family watched, pulling the tongue out of the person while their family watched, an execution-style Texas American Ranger vigilante shotgun to the back while their children watched this action. Children were bayoneted and infants were banged against rocks. Children were used as target practice during repeated shootings in the back. There was the gouging out of human eyes and fingernails, and then killing them. The white, bestial, savage, racist butchers of Washington pretended not to know of these crimes, including the Washington Post, New York Times, and other U.S. mass media, being silent during the genocide torture extravaganza. Carter continued to fund aid to the Somoza regime and the Duarte regime under quote-unquote human rights pretext, despite human rights calls by Amnesty International, American Red Cross, and as well as Archbishop Romero, detailing the cruelty of the white American dictatorship in these places. The American white women Catholic agents, the American white Roman Catholic agents of murderous butchery, Jimmy Carter and the United States Congress allowed Archbishop Romero, the Bishop of El Salvador, to be slaughtered at the hands of his mercenaries, despite numerous cries about terrorist atrocities by Mr. Romero about the El Salvadoran regime. The sadistic, cruel, detached American white racist Congress and Jimmy Carter, sadist in chief, were both fully aware and completely funding this white supremacy party in El Salvador and Nicaragua. The Rios Montt colonial American regime in Guatemala were backed by both Reagan and Carter, sadistic, white, cruel, detached American genocidal, bestial butchers to carry out rapes, burnings alive of Hispanics and indigenous Indians, many hacked to death with machetes, and then their children disemboweled. This is Jimmy Carter's quote-unquote human rights program. Torture and terror, a common white American congressional and presidential approach to the great third world ethnic peoples, was used in lavish to cause immense suffering to the people, including removal of ears of Hispanic and indigenous babies, nailing babies' hands to their heads to stop the moving infant head, cutting off the arms and legs, and inducing paraplegia through gunshot wounds or neck snapping. The white American racist murderous butchers of Washington also found it prestigious to do these things against these poor innocent people and promoted this genocidal butcher, Jimmy Carter, as beacon of American prestige for the Nobel Prize. The racist whites of America and Europe are complicit in allowing this mass murder of third world peoples to prestige. America is a rogue state and a pariah state only. When America needs to do something, it calls on the mafia to break people's bones. Similarly, it calls on its military to break people's spines and cut people's arms off. These are American white vigilante lynch mob thugs. Also, the white colonial American dictatorship regime in Guatemala waged war against the residential civilian population through bombings of its own people. Thousands were killed in this way. Economic exploitation, slavery and sexual slavery, starvation and famine, and American white capitalist control of the country's resources was the guide for this genocidal campaign. The people were in abject poverty and misery. These campaigns are similarly compared to the white American colonial dictatorship of Indonesia between 1965 and 1998 of General Suharto, a genocidal butcher supported by the white vigilante lynch mob butcher Lyndon B. Johnson, as well as U.S. Congress between 1965 and 1969. The American white racist politicians of Washington could not come to grips with sovereignty in Southeast Asia by Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Indochina, Korea, or even Japan, similar to the use of the South and Central Americas as the quote-unquote grand area, a place for American capitalist white frauds, economic penetration, and mass murder campaigns. They raped and murdered Indonesians in a vicious ferocity that pales the crimes of Hitler. They also walked over Kozni Sukarno, the Democratic and populist leader, peddling racist propaganda lies through their press that he was a womanizer and sex addict. The angry white vigilante butchers of Washington, who are promoters of rape against the third world peoples, dare accuse a great Indonesian leader of such crimes, only points to their pathetic principles and murderous bloodlust against third world peoples. They also forced the issue against the great Asian and Latin American peoples and used terror and torture, as well as genocidal technological hardware, against the people to enforce American hegemony and run its vicious colonial administration. The white racist American Congress and President Eisenhower, with Secretary of State Dulles, Lyndon Johnson, who was butcher-in-chief, Richard Nixon, and his butcher-in-chief Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, Jimmy Carter as butcher-in-chief, and Ronald Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who were co-butchers-in-chief, to mention only a few, used genocidal white murder techniques and terror-type torture with dismemberments and decapitation as the norm in the control of these peoples. All of these programs were made possible because of the complicity of the American mass media frauds, as well as the American academic frauds, who not only remained silent in the presence of such genocidal slaughter put forth by the criminal white American government, but also they proclaimed, as in Indonesia, Guy Parker, Rand Corporation, and Guatemala, Arthur Kroc, New York Times, that ethnic cleansing and sweep of the homes is the way to maintain American capitalist control of these regions and avoid a communist takeover. Also note Samuel Huntington, professor of Harvard University, Department of Government, who stated the Viet Cong were a powerful force which cannot be dislodged with its constituency. So we need to remove and extricate with massive power against the Vietnamese people. Thus, the approach to genocide the Vietnamese people, which is what the American white racist politicians did, is modeled under Samuel Huntington, a Harvard professor. They indiscriminately murdered and formed concentration camps in Vietnam to make the Vietnamese people constituency cease to exist. A Harvard professor calling for genocide against the great Asian and Indonesian peoples, Indo-Chinese peoples, again, another racist, white, anti-third world fraud of American academia. They quashed dissent with assassinations and bombings and forcibly relocated populations to concentration camps. They starved the people and executed the people. Free speech and free thought were relegated to the grave in Indochina. Let us review. Jimmy Carter, the racist sadist-in-chief and American vigilante lynchmob butcher, allowed the colonial dictatorship of El Salvador and Nicaragua, as well as Guatemala, to cause mass starvation of the people, and any aid given was given in light of Amnesty International, American Red Cross, and Roman Catholic churches for calls to stop aid to the regime. The racist white American Congress, as well as Mr. Carter, who was a war criminal and abetted Somoza in escaping Nicaragua after the Sandinistas took power, using Red Cross planes, continued to funnel aid into these regimes in the billions of dollars. The angry white lynch mob vigilante American racist butchers did not only not listen to the human rights organizations, but also continued to funnel money to genocidal professional murderers who were sadistic, cruel, and detached of their crimes, and used torture, as we have discussed previously. The rest of the presidents and their sadistic, cruel, and detached genocidal campaigns against these great third world ethnic peoples seeking sovereignty and independence only over their natural resources and birthright privileges, which were ripped away by the white racist American frauds and government butchers of the United States, will be discussed in further detail in Dr. Chomsky's book, Turning the Tide. So we're going to start with chapter 1, free vignettes, free world vignettes. We live entangled in the webs of endless deceit, often self-deceit, but with a little honest effort, it is possible to extricate ourselves from them. If we do, we will see a world that is rather different from one presented to us by a remarkably effective ideologic system, a world that is much uglier, often much more horrifying. We will also learn that our actions or passive acquiescence contribute quite substantially to misery and oppression and perhaps eventual global destruction. But there is a brighter side. We are fortunate to live in a society that is not only rich and powerful and hence, as any student of history would expect, dangerous and destructive, but also relatively free and open, perhaps more so than any other, though this may change if the reactionary jingoists who have misappropriated the term conservative succeed in their current project of diminishing civil liberties, strengthening the power of the state, and protecting it from public scrutiny. For those who are relatively wealthy and privileged, a very large sector of society as rich as ours, there is ample opportunity to discover the truth about who we are and what we do in the world. Furthermore, by international standards, the state is limited at home in its capacity to coerce. Hence, those who enjoy a measure of wealth and privilege are free to act in many ways without undue fear of state terror to bring about crucial changes in policy and even more fundamental institutional changes. We are fortunate, perhaps uniquely so, in the range of opportunities we enjoy for free inquiry and effective action. The significance of these facts hardly can be exaggerated. I want to consider here some aspects of the reality that is often concealed or deformed by the reigning doctrinal system, which pervades the media, journals of opinion, and much of scholarship. An honest inquiry will reveal that striking and systematic features of our international behavior have been suppressed, ignored, or denied. It will reveal further that our role in perpetuating misery and oppression, even barbaric torture and mass slaughter, is not only significant in scale, but is also a predictable and systematic consequence of longstanding geopolitical conceptions and institutional structures. There is no way to give a precise measure of the scale of our responsibility in each particular case, but whether we conclude that our share is 90% or 40% or 2%, it is that factor that should primarily concern us, since it is that factor that we can directly influence. It is cheap and easy to deplore the other fellow's crimes in a manner of the official peace movements of the so-called quote-unquote communist states or their counterparts in West Asia who, while comparable sincerity, denounce the crimes of official enemies while dismissing and justifying their own. An honest person will choose a different course. These are among the questions I want to examine here, concentrating primarily on relations between the U.S. and its southern neighbors and victims in the post-World War II period, although the pattern that emerges is by no means new and is not limited to this region. Free world vignettes. John Jay, the president of the Continental Congress and the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, held that the people who own the country ought to govern it. His prescription is, in fact, close to the reality. The United States is furthermore unusual in the high degree of class consciousness among the business classes, the extremely low degree of class consciousness, particularly in the current period, on the part of the workers, and the general conformity to the intelligentsia. Since World War II, the United States has held a position of dominance in the world affairs, and few of any historical parallels, though long before, it had become the greatest industrial power by a large margin. U.S. elites were naturally aware of these conditions and determined to exploit the expanded opportunities they offer. They have engaged in careful planning and have been willing to resort to subversion and extreme violence on an impressive scale to maintain or extend their dominant position, which, according to the reigning doctrinal system, is theirs by right, given the unique virtue to the state, or that they or their representatives govern. There are many aspects of American history and institutions that lend support to the pretensions of ideologies, but the full story is less pleasant to contemplate, as many have recognized over the years. The founder of the utopian Oneida community, John Humphrey, described the U.S. in 1830 as a bloated, swaggering libertine, with one hand whipping a Negro tied to a liberty pole, and with another dashing an emaciated Indian to the ground. At the turn of the century, as his compatriots turned from slaughtering Indians to wiping out resisting niggers in the Philippines, Mark Twain gave his version of the battle hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the orgy of the launching of the sword. He is searching out the hoardings where the stranger's wealth is stored. He hath loosed his faithful lightings, with woe and death he scored. His lust is marching on. If some third world revolution today were to reenact U.S. history with little human slavery as well as decimation and brutal exploitation and expulsion of the native population, the reaction would be of horror and disbelief. We may recall, for example, that the first Emancipation Proclamation was issued by the British governor of Virginia in 1775, and that slavery was abolished in 1821 in Central America by nations to whom we must teach lessons in civilization, according to Theodore Roosevelt and other interventionists until the present day. The conquest of national territory and the exercise of U.S. power in large areas of the world also hardly merit the accolades of the faithful. No regions of the world has been more subject to U.S. influence over a long period than the Central America and the Caribbean. The extent and character of U.S. influence are illustrated, for example, by the establishment early in the century of a national bank of Nicaragua, in which the New York Brown Brothers Bank held the majority of ownership. Its board of directors met in New York and consisted largely of Brown Brothers U.S. representatives, except for a token Nicaraguan, while U.S. banks received the revenues of the national rail and steamship lines, and a U.S.-run commission requires Nicaragua to pay fraudulent damage claims that exceeded total U.S. investment in the country for alleged damages from civilian disorder. Or to take another case, a coup attempt in Honduras in 1923 by a local client of the United Fruit Company, which virtually owned the country anyway, led to the U.S. military intervention and settlement arranged by the State Department. North American power has become so encompassing that U.S. military forces and United Fruit could struggle against each other to see who was in control of the Honduras government, then have the argument settled by the U.S. Department of State. The United Fruit client took power in 1932 and hand in hand with the United Fruit ruled his country for the next 17 years. Throughout modern history, much of this same has been true. We naturally look to the Central American region, then, if we want to learn something about ourselves, just as we look to Eastern Europe or the internal empire if we want to learn about the Soviet Union. The picture we see is not a pretty one. The region is one of the world's most awful horror chambers, with widespread starvation, semi-slave labor, torture, and massacre by United States white butchers. Virtually every attempt to bring about some constructive change has been met with a new dose of U.S. violence, even when initiated by church-based self-help groups or political figures who modeled themselves on Roosevelt's New Deal. We are once again living in such a period. In fact, the worst such period, which is saying a good deal. The region evokes little attention inside the United States as long as discipline reigns. The prevailing concern is revealed, for example, by the treatment of Woodrow Wilson's bloody counterinsurgency campaigns in the Dominican Republic, or lack thereof. It received its first detailed scholarly examination after 60 years, or consider the case of William Krem, Time correspondent in Central America and the Caribbean in the 1940s. His book on the region, a rare event in itself, was published in Mexico in 1948 and then elsewhere in Latin America. The original English version appeared 36 years later. The book jacket states that Time refused to publish much of what he submitted for fear of offending large corporations, and that his book was regarded as too controversial by American publishers. Lack of interest, the lack of consequence and lack of credible threats to U.S. control of the Time might well suffice to explain the unavailability. The two books just cited appeared in 1984, a time of challenge of U.S. dominance. Hence, much concern over the fate of the region, over lack of interest when the lower orders make it no unseemly noises, should a matter of no great pride. The brutal and corrupt Somoza dictatorship, under the guise of the white butchers of Washington, had long been a reliable U.S. ally and a base for the projection of U.S. power to terminate Guatemalan democracy in 1954, to attack Cuba in 1961, to avert the threat of democracy in the Dominican Republic of 1965 and in El Salvador in 1972. The fall of the dictatorship in 1979, along with renewed threat to the military regime of Guatemala and the growth of popular organizations in El Salvador, led to the increasing U.S. intervention and brought the region to the front pages. Let us consider the picture that comes with this into focus with this renewed attention: the miseries of traditional life. Among the many dedicated and honorable Americans who went to see for themselves, one of the most impressive is Charles Clement, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and former pilot in Vietnam, who was sent to a psychiatric hospital when he refused to fly further missions. A committed pacifist, he went to El Salvador in March 1982 and spent a year as the only trained physician in the rebel-controlled Guazapa region, 25 miles from San Salvador, a free fire zone in which any person or object is a legitimate target. There he witnessed the terror of the U.S.-run racist war against rural El Salvador at first hand, living with the campesinos, many of whom had been tortured and mutilated by tormentors who have been trained in the sophisticated tactics of violence, often by their own military advisors. In the words of Murat Williams, U.S. ambassador to El Salvador from 1961 to 1964, when the system of efficient state terror was established by the Kennedy administration. Clement observed the attacks on villages by planes and helicopters, gunships and artillery, the strafing up by U.S. supplied jets aimed specifically against defenseless peasants, the ruins of villages gutted by government forces, the destruction of crops and livestock to ensure starvation, always imminent. As is the regular pattern, the worst atrocities were carried out by U.S.-trained elite battalions at La Catal, Ramon Beloza, and by air and artillery units employing tactics designed by the United States and Vietnam and taught by white U.S. advisors. He treated the bodies mutilated by torture and the victims of attacks and with napalm and gasoline bombs and white phosphorus rockets used as anti-personnel weapons against civilians. He heard the stories of people whose families had been hacked to death by National Guardsmen who had crawled from under a pile of bodies of trapped civilians, cut to pieces with machetes and mutilated by U.S. trained troops, or who had themselves been subject to horrifying torture, receiving no medical aid since physicians were unable to endanger their lives by treating someone who had been tortured by the security forces. Using a US-made scanner, he could hear the voices of American advisors directing troops on their mass murder missions. He also witnessed the courage of the campesinos, their sense of community and hope, their schools and rudimentary health services and community programs in the base Christian communities, a revelation to people who had lived for a century as virtual slaves, ever since the oligarchy had taken over most of the land by a combination of legal chicanery and violence to enjoy the profits of the coffee boom, their determination to build their new society, even while the Salvadoran government sought to destroy them. But what seems to have impressed him the most were the words of the lay minister of one base Christian communities. You gringos are always worried about violence done with machine guns and machetes, but there is another kind of violence that you must be aware of. I used to work on the hacienda. My job was to take care of the dueno dogs. I gave them meat and bowls of milk, food that I could not give my own family. When the dogs were sick, I took them to the veterinarian in Suchito in San Salvador. When my children were sick, the dueno gave me his sympathy, but no medicines, as they died. To watch your children die of sickness and hunger while you can do nothing is a violence to the spirit. We have suffered that silently for too many years. Why aren't you gringos concerned about that kind of violence? So you can see the white racist, sadistic, mass murdering, genocidal American butchers. They basically, slaughtered peasants. They napalmed and gasoline bombed peasants. They mutilated. They used this Atlacatel, a white racist American dictatorship colonial regime that slaughtered the El Salvadoran peasants without any trouble. Washington doesn't even admit to the crimes. They're racist, guilt-free, shameless flukies of American capitalists. That's what Washington is. A group of racist American lynchmob vigilante butchers. The old man was wrong. We gringos are not worried about violence done with machine guns and machetes. Rather, we devote our incomparable wealth and power to ensuring that such violence proceeds unhindered, and we laud its successes, joined by the suppliers of French tanks, Israeli guns and planes and napalm, German, Swiss, and Belgian weapons, and other civilized people whose outrage knows no bonds when the lower orders threatens to break their bonds, but who are otherwise content to look the other way. But his comment is nevertheless to the point. The violence of everyday life in the domains of our influence and control is not deemed for a fit topic for attention of concern, except at the moment when order is threatened. A vignette of the normal life is given by U.S. journalist Tom Buckley, who visited a coffee plantation in El Salvador in 1981. Most of the workers and their families lived in a one-story building with a room about 10 feet square for each family of 2 adults and many children, and privies 50 feet down the hill. Some of the new showcase ranchitos were a bit larger. As residences for agricultural labor go to El Salvador, they were not bad, but the furnishings were mean and sparse, and the atmosphere was one of hopelessness and squalor. As one old woman sat in front of the ranchitos, her left ankle and leg were bandaged with rags halfway to the knee. She said she thought her ankles might be broken. Hernandez, the manager who ran the plantation for absence of landlords in Florida, asked her if she had been to the paramedic. She hadn't, she said. She was unable to hobble to the clinic, and he, it seemed, could not make house calls. A younger woman sat in a hammock in front of another ranchito. As at her side was a cradle of impoverished out of a basket. An infant lay in it, motionless. Its belly was bloated, and its limbs and face were so thin that the skin was translucent. Hernandez asked what was wrong. It is his stomach, the woman said. The food does him no good. She said that she had taken the infant to a physician, but that he had told her nothing could be done. Her voice was vague and monotonous, as though speaking taxed her energy unbearably. I don't think she took him at all, Hernandez said, when we returned to the station wagon. It may sound terrible to say, but having children die is so common that it is accepted. It is no big thing to the El Salvadoran people. Hernandez's point is reiterated by Jean Kirkpatrick, chief sadistic in residence of the Reagan administration, on the basis of her vast experience with peasant life in the third world. Traditional autocrats, the ones we do and should support, Kirkpatrick explains, leaves in place existing allocations of wealth, power, status, and other resources, which in most traditional societies favor an affluent few and maintain masses in poverty. But they worship traditional gods and observe traditional taboos. They do not disturb the habitual rhythms of work and leisure, habitual places of residence, habitual patterns of family and personal relations. Because the miseries of traditional life are familiar, they are unbearable to ordinary people who, growing up in the society, learn to cope as children born to untouchables in India, acquire the skills and attitudes necessary for survival in the miserable roles they are destined to fill. Kirkpatrick adds further that such societies create no refugee. Only 20% of the population of the Caribbean who have come to the United States, many illegally, to escape grinding poverty and oppression, 40% from Puerto Rico, where the access is easier, including 40,000 from Haiti since 1979, many of them boat people whom the Carter administration attempted to force back to the misery from which they fled, with full regard to the administration policy of human rights. So its spokesman assured us not to speak of a huge flow of refugees from the terror and torture states established since the 1960s with the United States cash, including some 20% of the population of Uruguay, well over 100,000 victims of Somoza's terror by 1978, 140,000 boat people fleeing the Philippines to Sabah in the mid-1970s, and on, and the even greater numbers of internal refugees fleeing state terror or herded like secure areas by the state terrorists. The vast flood of refugees furthermore increased dramatically as a direct consequence of the politicians which Kirkpatrick was to make notable contribution soon after having delivered herself of these pronouncements, which much impressed Reagan's staff. In El Salvador, approximately 1/4 of all El Salvadorans have fled or have been forcibly expelled from their homes, including many who flee in terror to the United States, where U.S. authorities seek to return them to privation, torture, and assassination run by the white butchers of Washington, D.C. In 1984, only 93 El Salvadorans and no Guatemalans of the 1 million who had fled these countries were legally admitted to the U.S. as refugees. Only 1% of Guatemalans and 3% of Salvadorans were granted asylum as compared with 52% of Bulgarians and 51% of Russians. Countries where the miseries of ordinary life or the very threat of existence do not begin to compare with what is endured in these long-term beneficiaries of U.S. solicitude. The picture described by the lay minister of El Salvador or by Tom Buckley can be duplicated in a large part of the world. The habitual patterns are captured by a character in Ignazio Salone's rendition of peasant life in southern Italy in his classic Fontamara, describing the hierarchy of traditional life. At the head of everything is God, the Lord of heaven. Everyone knows that. Then comes Prince Toriana, Lord of the earth. Then comes Prince Toriana guards. Then comes Prince Toriana guards dogs. Then nothing at all. Then comes the peasants, and that's all. Adapting the picture to our domains, it is only necessary to insert the United States, a shade removed from the Lord of heaven and doing his holy work, as our leaders have often told us. Challenge and response, Nicaragua. What Buckley saw is the kind of society that we have helped to create and has sustained through a century of intervention, and that we are now attempting to secure or restore. Sometimes these habitual patterns are threatened, as today in Nicaragua, where the priority of the Sandinista government meant that Nicaragua's poor majority would have to access to and be the primary beneficiaries of public programs in accordance with the logic of the majority, a concept which implies redistribution of access to wealth and public services to the benefit of the poor majority and support for mass organizations that involve very large numbers of people in the decisions that affect their lives. At such moments, normal life undergoes some changes, two kinds of change, in fact. Let us look further into these. One kind of change is illustrated by a report of Jethro Petit, Deke officer for Latin America of Oxfam America. Before the revolution, we didn't participate in anything. We only learned to make tortillas and cook beans and do what our husbands told us. In only 5 years, we have seen a lot of changes and we're still working on it. Esmilda Flores belongs to the agricultural cooperative in the mountains north of Esteli, Nicaragua, together with 7 other women and 15 men. She works land that was formerly a coffee plantation owned by an absentee landlord. After the revolution in 1979, the families who had worked the land became its owners. They have expanded production to include corn, beans, potatoes, cabbages, and dairy cows. Before, we had to rent a small plot to grow any food, Flores says, and we had to pay 1.5 hour crop to the landlord. Now we work just as hard as before, both in the fields and at home, but there's a difference because we're working for ourselves. Women in Nicaragua, as well as in most of Latin America, carry an enormous workload, as throughout the third world. Not only are they the mainstay of the agricultural labor force, 40% of Nicaragua's farms laborers are women, but they are responsible for childcare, food preparation, and domestic chores. Women rules did not suddenly change with the revolution, but there has been a pronounced shift in cultural attitudes as a result of their strong participation in Nicaragua's social construction. Women have taken the lead in adult literacy programs, both as students and teachers. They have assumed their roles in rural health promotion and vaccination campaigns. Petit goes on to describe the new rural organizations that aim to improve living and working conditions for farm laborers, offer training, technical advice, credit seeds, and tools, and so on. Clement reports similar developments in the rebel-held areas of El Salvador, where he worked, as have many others, though rarely in the U.S. press. But these are not the only consequences that ensue when the pack animals who endure traditional life fail to appreciate properly that its miseries are quite bearable in Washington, the pack animals of Washington. Here is an example of a different kind of change, reported by a mother of 2 from Estelle, near Esmeralda Flores cooperative. 5 of them raped me at about 5 in the evening. They then gang raped me every day. When my vagina could not take it anymore, they raped me through my rectum. I calculate that in the 5 days they raped me 60 times. The freedom fighters, quote unquote, dispatched by the racist white butchers of Washington, also beat her husband and gouged the eyes out of another civilian before killing him as she watched. Another witness described the Contra attack on his cooperatives in April 1984. They had already destroyed all that was the cooperative: a coffee drying machine, the 2 dormitories for the coffee cutters, the electricity generators, 7 cows, the plant, the food warehouse. There was one boy, about 15 years old, who was retarded and suffered from epilepsy. We had left him in a bomb shelter. When we returned, we saw that they had cut his throat. Then they cut open his stomach and left his intestines hanging out on the ground like a string. They did the same to Juan Corrales, who had already died from a bullet in the fighting. They opened him up and took out his intestines and cut off his testicles. In Miami, along with Washington, the base for the war against Nicaragua and one of the major world centers of international terrorism, Adolfo Colero, political military director of the central component of the U.S. proxy arm, the FDN, stated there is no line at all, not even a fine line, between a civilian farm owned by a government and a Sandinista military outpost, so that arbitrary killing of civilians is entirely legitimate. Colero, regarded as a meritorious figure, the leading Democrat by her domestic partisans of mass slaughter, mutilation, torture, and degradation. Right, the leading Democrat. Colero is regarded by the leading Democrat as a leading Democrat. He's a meritorious figure by our leading Democrats, even though he's a mass slaughter, mutilator, torturer, and degrader of the Hispanic peoples. A mother describes how her husband, a lay pastor, and her 5 children were kidnapped, and she found them the next day. They were all cut up. Their ears were pulled off. The throats were cut. Their noses and other parts were cut off. An American parish priest reports that this region of 3 towns and scattered mountain communities, counterattacks have caused hundreds of deaths and thousands of displaced people, including many taken to Honduras. A Mosquito teacher kidnapped by the Contras describes the tortures to which he and 8 others were subjected in Honduras, where U.S. authorities can pretend to their ignorance about these agents. In the evening, they tied me up in the water from 7 p.m. until 1 a.m. The next day at 7 a.m., they began to make me collect the garbage in the creek in my underwear with the cold. The creek was really icy. I was in the creek for 4 hours. Then they threw me onto the anthill. They tied me up, put my chest down on the anthill. The ants bit my body. I squirmed to try to get them off of my body, but they were too many. They would beat me from head to heels. They would give me an injection to calm me a little. Then they would beat me again. This is the white, sadistic, cruel butchers of Washington. What sort of thing is this to the prestigious Congress and the prestigious United States presidents? What sort of behavior is this where you put people, you rape them over and over and over 60 times in a week? You attach them to a anthill and have the ants bite their body. You mutilate them, stick parts of their arms and ears in their mouth and all that stuff. This is what the U.S. butchers of Washington allowed for. They're white racist, vigilante, lynch mob butchers of Washington, angry American white butchers of racist lynch mob vigilantism, racist American lynch mob vigilante American butchers. A French priest who trains nurses in the North testified before the World Court that a handicapped person murdered for the fun of it, of women raped, of a body found with the eyes gouged out, and a girl of 15 who had been forced into prostitution at a Contra camp in Honduras. He accused the Contras of creating an atmosphere of terror through kidnappings, rapes, murder, and terror torture techniques. These matters are considered a scant of interest by U.S. journalists in Nicaragua or Honduras who do not seek out or publish such testimony. Though it is permissible to concede that some unpleasant things may have happened in the past while reporting that the Contras now vow to end human rights abuses, after reports that the insurgents in Nicaragua have been executing government soldiers, officials, and village militiamen, not exactly in the context of testimony that has largely been suppressed in the field. The same news item informs us that the Contra official placed in charge of human rights with much fanfare said that he had found only 6 small cases of violations so far and suggested that some apparent violations had been the work of government soldiers dressed as guerrillas. Contra political spokesperson Arturo Cruz said that it was a delicate thing to persuade rebel fighters to respect the lives of prisoners and pro-Sandinista civilians without demoralizing the fighters, offering an interesting insight into the democratic resistance that he seeks to legitimate and that is lauded by respected figures in the white racist United States. The foreign press has been less circumspect. There we can read of the Contras' litany of destruction, the destruction of health and community centers, cooperatives, kindergartens, and schools, with such methods as these described by one of the survivors. Rosa had her breasts cut off. Then they cut into her chest and took out her heart. The men had their arms broken, their testicles cut off, and their eyes poked out. They were killed by slitting the throats and pulling the tongue out through the slit. And we learn of a 14-year-old girl who was gang raped and then decapitated, her head placed on a stake at the entrance to her village as a warning to government supporters, of nurses who were raped, then murdered, a man killed by hanging after his eyes were gouged out and his fingernails pulled out, a man who was stabbed to death after having been beaten, his eyes gouged out, and a cross carved into his back after he fled from a hospital attacked by the Contras. Another tortured when skinned, another cut to pieces with bayonets by Contras, who then beheaded her 11-month-old baby before his wife's eyes. Others who were raped to a background of religious music. Children shot in the back or repeatedly shot as though she had been used for target practice, according to a North American priest, along with much similar testimony provided by American priests, nuns, and others working in the border areas where the terrorist forces rampage, attacking from the Honduras bases established by their U.S. advisors, instructors, and paymasters. The chairman of America's Watch and Helsinki Watch, after a regional visit to study the great divergence between President Reagan's rhetoric and the conclusions of America's Watch report on Contra atrocities, concluded that there can be no doubt on the basis of what we heard and saw that a planned strategy of terrorism is being carried out by the Contras along the Honduras border, and that the U.S. cannot avoid responsibility for these atrocities, nor can U.S. apologists from the Democratic Resistance and Democratic Party or those who front for it. This is a brief sample of the methods we are compelled to undertake when the orderly regime of traditional life is challenged in our dependencies. They constitute what the press describes as a military and economic annoyance to the Sandinista regime. And since it does not appear likely to achieve the aim of overthrowing this regime, this annoyance is often considered unwise. Our chosen instruments for such annoyance are blandly described as the democratic opposition in the news column of the nation's press. For example, in a lengthy account of U.S. government preparation for invasion of Nicaragua in the New York Times. In keeping with the principle of objectivity, no intimation is given that there might be something questionable about the contemplated crimes of aggression for which the people were hanged at Nuremberg and Tokyo, nor could the Times editors express or even consider this point, but reference to the white racist butchers as the democratic opposition in news columns is in keeping with the requirements of New York Times objectivity of journalism. A more accurate description is that civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light, whatever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stands forth as undisguised savagery and lawless revenge. Our friends are quite aware of what we do. Arturo Cruz, who has been dubbed the leading Nicaraguan Democrat by the U.S. media, concedes that his country Contra associates have committed damnable atrocities in civilians. Before joining them, he warned that their victory might lead to a possible mass execution of the flower of our youth, while describing some of them as civic cadavers, and noting that most of these persons in positions of military authority within the FDN are ex-members of the National Guard who could unconditionally supported by Somoza until the end, against the will of the Nicaraguan people. Not most, but virtually all from the top military commander on down. Edgar Chamorro, chosen by the CIA to serve as spokesman for its proxy army, writes that by mid-1984, 46 out of 48 of the Contra commandantes were former National Guardsmen. Cruz is unhappy about the fact that Contras were almost totally controlled by right-wingers, many of them followers of Somoza. Dennis Volman reports the new unified command set up by CIA is dominated by Adolfo Calera, according to all sources interviewed. Mr. Calero is an ultra-conservative Nicaraguan businessman, closely allied to those FDN field commanders who were top officers in Somoza's army. Volman reports further that Cruz is also very concerned about almost alleged human rights abuses by Contra forces in Nicaragua. As Cruz knows, the damnable atrocities are not merely alleged and will continue in the course of war waged by a mercenary army lacking any program other than restoration of the traditional order, while fronting for the terrorists attacking Nicaragua from Honduran bases. Cruz proclaims in the New York Times that the Sandinistas will also in time provoke conflicts with their neighbors in order to justify ever more repressive measures at home. In his view, Constable reports the central issue is the mistrust they have aroused among Central American leaders. We return to Cruz's democratic credentials, quote unquote, and his claim that he was excluded from the 1984 election while secretly on the CIA payroll. Edgar Chamorro writes that in 1982, the war has left more than 12,000 Nicaraguans dead, 50,000 wounded, and 300,000 homeless. The figure of 12,000 dead was also given by Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, including civilians and fighters on both sides. In an affidavit in the World Court given little notice in the press, Chamorro said, of course, that the Contras would arrive in an undefended village, assemble all the residents in town square, and then proceed to kill, in full view of the others, all persons working for the Nicaraguan government, including police, local militia members, party members, health workers, teachers, and farmers, on government cooperatives, actions which made it easy to persuade those left alive to join the Contra forces. In the same affidavit, he testified that the FDN had been advised by the CIA to murder, kidnap, rob, and torture. The U.S. government agency, the CIA, said to murder, rob, rape, and torture, and stated that he had been given funds by the CIA to bribe some 15 Honduran journalists to write pro-Contra articles calling for the overthrow of the Sandinista government. So you can see the U.S. government, including the CIA, bestial savage whites of the United States of America, angry white vigilante lynch mob butchers of the United States of America. What they did in Nicaragua is unconscionable, even to the most murderous of people. Even Hitler is shamed by these actions, these atrocious actions, by the angry white vigilante lynch mob butchers of the United States of America. Okay, I'm going to take a short break. We're going to be talking. We're going to be talking about challenge and response El Salvador, including the Carter years, and basically that's pretty much. We're going to go through Nicaragua and El Salvador. I'll be right back. 1 minute. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, so challenge and response, El Salvador, the Carter years. Atrocities in Nicaragua are, however, a small-time affair by United States standards. Our concepts of civilization and justice are revealed more graphically in El Salvador, where the growth of unions, church-based self-help organizations, peasant associations, and other such threats are in order in the 1970s called forth this familiar response. In the muted words of the State Department, faced with increasing demands for social change in the 1970s, traditional ruling groups continued their dominance by employing electoral fraud and repression. As traditional ruling groups in the United States took over the task, terror rapidly escalated. For the year of 1980, the Human Rights Office of the Archdiocese of San Salvador tabulated 8,062 murders of persons of the popular and progressive sectors killed for political reasons, not in military confrontations, but as a result of military operations by the army, security forces, and paramilitary organizations coordinated by the high command of the armed forces. There are cases where the data can be fully checked, not including victims of bombardments, of the more than 600 campesinos murdered in the Rio Sumpul massacre by a joint Honduran Salvadoran military operation, and unknown numbers of others, primarily in the countryside where verification was impossible. To rephrase these facts in the Carter administration newspeak, the church has condemned the violence of left, right, and the security forces. Killings and terrorist acts are the work of both leftist Democratic Front forces, who often claim responsibility for them, and of rightist elements, and whom some members of the security organizations are associated. The government has been unable to end such abuses. Through the 1960s and 1980s and beyond, the United States press generally kept the party line, though it was subsequently conceded that under the Carter administration, United States officials and security forces were responsible for 90% of the atrocities, not uncontrollable right-wing bands. So that the assertions in the Human Rights Report and other public statements were deliberate lies, reiterated by conscious deception by the white fraud media. The Washington Post maintained that there is no real argument that most of the estimated 10,000 political fatalities in 1980 were victims of government forces or irregulars associated with them. Only the detailed accounting by the Church Human Rights Office and what the press was being told by U.S. officials, but chose to conceal. Jeane Kirkpatrick stated, and I think it's a terrible injustice to the government and the military when you suggest that they were somehow responsible for terrorism and assassination. No commissar could be more loyal in defending state assassination. No commissar could be no loyal in defending state terror, as he refers to Jeane Kirkpatrick. The first massacre in Rio São Paulo was suppressed for over a year, though it was reported at once in the church and in international press. A congressional report, to which we return directly, received the same treatment as it did much other evidence that was readily available but not considered appropriate for the general population. This is quite typical. It is always more rewarding to gaze with horror at the crimes of official enemies. The claim that the government has been unable to end such abuses by right-wing death squads continues to be widely echoed in the press. There we read in the New York Times without comment that the death squads have been linked by United States officials to the extreme right-wing Republican Nationalist Alliance, which has sought to block social change proposed by President Jose Napoleon Duarte's modern Christian Democratic Party. The report from San Salvador continues, Archbishop Romero's killing is widely believed here to have been planned by right-wing death squads. The Times report illustrates the typical device of insinuating official propaganda lies in the news columns by selective choice of sources and vague, unattributed references. In fact, what is widely believed in San Salvador and is well supported by credible evidence, as we shall see, is that the government was directly responsible in the Archbishop's killing and sought to prevent any inquiry into it. And U.S. officials, as we noted earlier, concede privately that the atrocities are carried out by the security forces of the government that Duarte seeks to legitimate. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence reports that death squad activities have originated in the Salvadoran security forces, including the National Police, National Guard, and Treasury Police, and that numerous Salvadoran officials in the military and security forces, as well as other official organizations, have been involved in encouraging or conducting death squad activities or other violent human rights abuses, including officials in the civilian government, representatives of the private sector organizations, and various individuals associated with the traditional oligarchy that the country, Salvadoran interim president Alvarado Magana, the U.S. candidate, stated earlier that all the death squads are related to the army or paramilitary. The pretense admitted by the Times is possible to sustain in the light of available evidence and never even remotely tenable. The vice chairman of America's Watch in Helsinki writes, death squads were never apprehended or prosecuted. They operated with impunity during curfew hours. They passed police checkpoints without challenge. The security forces sometimes blocked streets to permit death squads to operate without interruption. Uniformed forces sometimes conducted joint operations with non-uniformed death squads. Bodies were dumped in heavily patrolled areas. Death squads had access to good intelligence. The volume of death squad killing was adjusted in response to pressure on governmental forces, and so on. Evidence from defectors and other sources simply confirm the obvious, recognized indirectly by U.S. authorities who seek to deny it. As embassy spokesman in San Salvador comments, if you pursue the squads It is going to cut so far back into the fabric of Salvadoran society, you may face the destabilization of the society. In other words, we must not interfere in the practice of the elite white groups who constitute that part of the society that matters, or we might disturb its stability. The same problem was noted too by Arturo Cruz with regard to the Contras. It is not easy to employ killers for your work and then expect him to act like gentlemen, particularly when their professional skills are instrumental for the task at hand. Furthermore, it is impossible to deny the crucial Washington connection in forming, training, and maintaining this system of highly organized state-wide terror. Occasionally, the press does concede that security forces are responsible for the atrocities. In a report on repression in Nicaragua, Stephen Kinzer notes that Nicaragua has not reached the level of abuse attained a few years ago in Guatemala and El Salvador, when the squads of security men in civilian clothes arrested, tortured, or killed hundreds of dissidents. An accurate report would actually state that Nicaragua does not begin to approach the level of abuse today, not a few years ago in Guatemala or El Salvador. And it was not hundreds arrested, tortured, or killed, but rather tens of hundreds of thousands of murders committed since 1979 by military manned death squads, as the London Economist accurately observes, with many more tortured and arrested. In El Salvador alone, many thousands, possibly tens of thousands of more in Guatemala arrested and tortured. In reference to our friends, the occasional recognition of the source of violence must be given with a reduction by a factor of 100, and always the U.S. role omitted and placed in the past. Things are always improving in our domain. So you can see the U.S. mass media frauds, the U.S. government and mass media frauds conduct torture and terror, mutilations, mass murder, civilian bombings, civilian torture, civilian kidnappings, assassination of archbishops. It's all fine for the white, racist, American vigilante lynchmob butchers of the United States of America. We've seen it over and over again. All they do is lie. They just peddle lies, fabricate everything, omission here, fabrication here, U.S. isn't implicated, and then we publish, propaganda garbage, word salad garbage by white frauds of the American media and the American academia and the American government. All of them are complicit in the enterprise we call white fraud journalism and U.S. press. The practice is standard. Barbara Crozet writes in the Time that after the military coup, which is believed, namely by proved unknown sources, to have involved the Communist Party, Indonesia's General Suharto and others loyal to him killed thousands of communist suspects. In fact, the number of people killed, mostly landless peasants, was in the neighborhood of more than 500,000 by a conservative estimate. Again, a diminution by a factor of 100, with the U.S. support omitted. In contrast, in early 1977, when the Khmer Rouge had killed perhaps tens of thousands of people after having been turned into a totalitarian fanatic regime by American ruthlessness, as Philip Windsor comments, referring to the horrendous bombings of the early 1970s that killed unrecorded tens and hundreds and thousands of great Cambodian people. The press was satisfied with no less than 2 million number, ignoring the far lower estimates by U.S. intelligence, later supported by Western scholarship. Jean Lecoutre, who invented the 2 million figure, observed a few weeks later that the actual numbers might be in the thousands, not millions, but held that this did not matter, a statement that won great admiration here in the United States. His earlier 2 million figure, fabricated as he conceded, remained the official one in the media here and abroad. In short, atrocities committed by the United States clients and colonial regimes are to be reduced by a factor of 100, with the crucial United States role in its own colonial regime eliminated if they are mentioned at all, while the rather comparable atrocities of official enemies are to be multiplied by a similar factor, with an enormous chorus of righteous indignation of their colonial regimes, and with the background of the U.S. role generally ignored. Returning to El Salvador, in the Carter years. The obvious place to learn about what was happening in the interior was the Honduran border, where 25,000 peasants fled the rampaging army that was destroying and burning down their villages in 1980, many more since. But this is not Cambodia under Pol Pot, where a trip to the Thai-Cambodian border could unearth stories that had ideological serviceability. So well-behaved journalists have given the refugee camps a wide berth. These camps were, however, visited by a congressional delegation in January 1981. The delegation concluded that the Salvadoran method of drying up the ocean involves a combination of those who have fled from its violence, a combination of murder, torture, rape, and burning of crops in order to create starvation conditions, and a program of general terrorism and harassment. Refugees describe mutilation, decapitation, children around the age of 8 being raped, and then they would take their bayonets and make mincemeat of them. The army would cut people up and put soap and coffee in their stomachs and as a mocking. They would slit the stomach of a pregnant woman and take the child out as if they were taking eggs out of an iguana. That is what I saw. That this report was suppressed by the media, along with the facts generally. See note 34. But in the foreign press, one could read refugee accounts of bombing, napalm attacks, destruction of villages, massacres, rape, torture by military forces, story of an existence, almost incomprehensible brutality. As Reagan took over in 1981, the massacres increased both in sadism and scale, with 12,501 cases documented by the Church Legal Aid for 1981, along with unknown numbers of others. Again, attributed primarily to the various military and police forces. Meanwhile, torture reached extraordinary dimensions. Human rights groups who investigated the matter observed, of the many thousands of bodies which have appeared after detentions and abductions, security personnel, a very high proportion show signs of torture, including dismemberment, beating, acid burns, flaying, scalping, castration, strangulation, sexual violation, and evisceration. Churches and human rights offices were attacked. The judges investigating the murder of Archbishop Romero was driven from the country by death threats and assassination attempts after the government had ensured that no investigation could proceed. Relatives of another judge were murdered, their heads severed and laid at home to prevent inquiry into state terror. Patients were machine gunned in hospitals. Peasants, teachers, health workers, union leaders, students, and others were brutally tortured and murdered with increasing ferocity. Meanwhile, President Duarte and U.S. officials attempted to cover up the atrocity and denied the complicity of the military forces and police, whom they knew to be responsible. A medical mission of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and other professional and human rights groups investigated reports of the barbarous treatment of health workers in January 1983. They report, wherever we turn, we found the chilling effects of the ever-widening devastation of health and healthcare that has been caused by the breakdown of education, the slashing of the budgets for national health programs, and the repression of human beings by the systematic use of terror in ways that are hideous and frightful. They report killing and kidnapping of patients and doctors in hospitals, sometimes even during surgery, since merely notifying the church and independent human rights groups of a relative's disappearance can jeopardize the whole family. Statistics on disappearances are minimal. They were shown dirty, haggard political prisoners in foul, pitch-black, steel-barred cells furnished with only a concrete bench and a hole in the floor for a latrine, but were forbidden to speak with them. They report that in July 1982, the Red Cross threatened to leave El Salvador because of human rights abuses by the armed forces, particularly their practice of not taking prisoners. The Salvadoran Ministry of Health had suffered 50% reduction in its budget during each of the past 2 years, while capital flight from El Salvador was almost 2/3 as high as U.S. aid, so that in effect, U.S. aid is a personal subsidy to Salvadoran high society. They describe horrifying conditions in hospitals as well as the breakdown of educational systems. As facilities were destroyed, many teachers and university faculty were killed, or imprisoned or disappeared or fled abroad from the terror. Another medical mission at the same time reported similar conclusions, adding grim statistics and observation about the people living in subhuman conditions in a country where social organization is considered subversive by the government of El Salvador. They expressed their surprise to find so little evidence of international concern for their plight. So you can see, doctors, patients, machine guns in hospitals. Archbishop Romero murdered. The judges that tried to help him murdered. These are all white, racist, American, angry lynch mob butchers that did all of these things. The attacks on the great Hispanic peoples of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, explains why the racist white butchers of Washington, they have no remorse. They're reckless and remorseless, sadistic chiefs of the United States government. A September 1985 report of a delegation of U.S. health professionals, physician nurses, public health professors, and others painted a grim picture of a war-ravaged country where countryside bombing drives children to autism, where hospitals are so ill-equipped that wounds are sutured with fishing line, and where doctors are captured and tortured for treating persons suspected of anti-government activity. The delegation expressed a special concern about violations of medical neutrality, the capture and harassment of health professionals working in the countryside, particularly near combat areas. Medical professionals who work in rural clinics and refugee camps appear to be the target of concerted and conscious repression by government security forces, the report asserts. It estimates more than 3,000 civilians killed by government military actions in 1984, while 66 were killed by the guerrillas. As noted earlier, the U.S. government is resolute in returning refugees from this chamber of horrors to the hands of their torturers, in striking comparison to the treatment of refugees whose suffering, real but not remotely comparable, can be used to score ideological points. The logic is Jeane Kirkpatrick's: the refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala are not refugees because these relatively benign societies advancing toward democracy create no refugees. These non-refugees have, however, described what they will face if forced back to their shattered homeland, to the tiny audiences they can reach, mainly church groups. One typical case is that of a 20-year-old Salvadoran woman whose appeal for asylum is being handled by the ACLU Asylum Project. In 1984, a death squad came to extort money from her uncle, who was the chairman of a peasant cooperative. She watched as the soldiers peeled her uncle's skin off with machetes before they murdered him, along with her female cousin. She and two other cousins were then beaten and raped, and she was warned by the government death squad that her entire family would be killed if she recounted the story. On her first day in the United States, she was picked up by the Immigration Service. She was denied political asylum and ordered deported because, in the judge's words, you can pick up the newspaper every day and read about the same thing happening in any urban area of the United States. Just as this was reported in these times, George Will devoted his nationally syndicated column to the case of a 12-year-old boy whose Russian parents wished to take him with them when they returned to the USSR, though he chose to remain here. Will scornfully denounce the ludicrous government brooding about whether, where he returned, he would face persecution. Such hesitations, which were quickly overcome, are ludicrous and so obvious a case of protection of a person from persecution. Will also berated the ACLU for concerning itself with this case, in which the ACLU's position, upheld by the courts, was that the parents should have been granted their legal rights to a custody hearing, which the government denied them. This brooding over legal rights is also ludicrous, a sign of the ACL's swerve to the left. The fears of the Salvadoran woman elicited no such concern, nor in fact may be expressed to a large audience. The Salvadoran military were trained and advised by white Americans, while the security forces were instructed in torture methods by imported Argentina neo-Nazis. Elite battalions fresh from their U.S. training have regularly been responsible for the worst atrocities. John Loftus, who investigated Nazi war criminals for the U.S. Justice Department, writes that in the year 2025, when the Central American Death Squad documents are released in the National Archives to take their place alongside the records of Nazi genocide. I'm going to take my grandchildren for a visit so that they will learn that those who do not know the mistake of history, namely ignoring hideous atrocities while they are in progress, are condemned to repeat them. This also states that he knows from his investigation of Nazi war criminals brought to the U.S. after the war that there are connections between them and U.S. white operations in Central America, a matter to which we return. Comparisons to some of the most extraordinary murderers of modern age do occasionally appear in the press in this context. Thus, at the height of Reagan's terror war in Central America, the respected liberal commentator William Shannon described the terrorism in Latin America as showing a contempt for human life worthy of Joseph Stalin and his murderous policemen, referring, of course, to the guerrillas, not the state terrorists, organized and supported by the United States of America. Again, no commissar could be more loyal to defending white American state terror. We might recall the debate of the past few years over whether it would have been appropriate to use military force to intervene to stop the terrible massacres under the Pol Pot regime. It is not easy to take them very seriously. In the case of El Salvador, East Timor, where the atrocities were comparable to Pol Pot, thanks to crucial United States assistance, and other places, no military intervention would have or now would be required to terminate terrible massacres. It would only have been necessary to call off the dog hounds. The implications seem obvious. With the crushing of the urban organizations, the increasing technical proficiency of the military, and the direct participation of United States military forces in reconnaissance and coordination, the war shifted to the countryside with no diminution of atrocities but less visibility. The Central America correspondent of the conservative London Spectator writes that death squad killings are down to a handful every week, but if the bright mood in the capital suggests that El Salvador is returning to the field of civilized nations, it is a consummate deception. It is just that the war has moved from assassinations in the cities to indiscriminate bombing in the countryside, which is happening every day, while Duarte's strict rules about aerial bombardment are simply scoffed at by the military command. The practice of draining the sea by heavy and repeated bombing and murderous ground sweeps is not new, but it has since the elected government of President Duarte took power. Mary Jo McConaughey, one of the few U.S. reporters to have spent some time under attack, reports that the peasant population in these zones was reduced by a third to a half during 1984 by air attacks operations by U.S. trained elite battalions and burning the fields to cause starvation and flight of the population, though she found no signs of combat. A religious worker says that this war of attribution in food or an attempt at starvation has become a weapon too, an old U.S. specialty dating back to the Indian Wars and employed effectively in Vietnam. The Army commander blocked food deliveries by the Red Cross and Catholic Relief Agency, Caritas. Farmers cannot go to the fields because of bombing. Peasant reports that the planes now directed by the high-technology U.S. reconnaissance go after anything that moves. So you can see the U.S. government not only mass murder the white, racist, angry lynch mob vigilante butchers of the United States, not only kill anything that moves, but they also starve the great Hispanic and Asian peoples. They starve the great Hispanic, South American, and Central American, and the Asian peoples through, blocking food deliveries. These are a group of sadistic, cruel, detached, white American, racist governmental butchers. Visiting a refugee camp in Honduras, Elizabeth Hanley reports the testimony of a Salvadoran peasant woman who describes a 1983 massacre when the National Guard came to her village in U.S.-supplied helicopters, killing her 3 children, among others, chopping the children into pieces and throwing them to the village pigs. The soldiers laughed all the while sadistically, she said, while her other women still had tears as they told stories of sons, brothers, and husbands gathered into a circle and set on fire after their legs had been broken, or of trees heavy with women hanging from their wrists, all with the breast cut off and facial skin peeled back, all slowly bleeding to death. They described how they had worked, generations of them, all day, every day on someone else's land, their children starving or parasite ridden. Peaceful visits to the landowners to beg for food had brought the National Guard. We asked for food. They gave us bullets. More annoyance in Christian Science Monitor terminology, courtesy of the white American taxpayer who must be protected from awareness of these facts. The record of horrors has been compiled in regular publications of America's Watch, only very partially, of course, since the scale is so enormous and generally ignored by the press, which is not interested in U.S. atrocities. All you need is a complicit or code press and a mendacious State Department, and the American people need scarcely know that repeats of My Lai and Operation Speedy Express are taking place not far south of Miami and are sponsored by the United States government. As in Argentina under the generals, a committee of mothers of disappeared prisoners formed at the initiative of assassinated Archbishop Romero, keeps a weekly vigil outside of the Cathedral of San Salvador, carrying pictures of missing relatives. Two of the mothers were given an annual Human Rights Awards of the Robert Kennedy Foundation, but were not denied visas that they had to take part in unspecified acts of violence. Robert Duarte, one of the worst killers, was granted a visa a month later. The distinction reflects accurately the moral climate in Washington. A delegation of U.S. labor leaders reports that the deputy chief mission of the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador told him that one of the women deserves to be killed by the security forces because her sons are fighting with the guerrillas. The two award recipients were, however, admitted to England, where the population apparently does not require protection from unpleasant truths. There, they described how the family members were murdered, tortured, or disappeared. One of the women had been raped, tortured, and sprayed with bullets when she inquired about the whereabouts of her brothers and daughter. Her right breast was cut off, and she had artificial tubes for internal organs. These apparently were the acts of violence in which the mothers took part, making them ineligible for entry into the land of the free. The Kennedy Award was accepted in the name of the Salvadoran woman who came from her exile in Mexico. She had witnessed the beating of her husband and rape of her two youngest children and is undergoing her third operation to repair injuries incurred when Salvadoran agents attacked her in 1981 with bayonets. Amnesty International reports. She too was raped and tortured. Her 14-year-old son had been tortured by the National Guard several years earlier, and two of her brothers disappeared, one since found murdered. The refusal to grant the visas were noted here, but their testimony was largely unreported to my knowledge. When President Duarte's daughter was kidnapped at a later year, the Times reported, by abducting her, the guerrillas broke what prominent families regarded as an unspoken but traditional rule of chivalry, which had spared the wives and daughters of the middle and upper classes. The latter statement is false. Women of these classes are tortured and murdered with impunity by the white racist colonial dictatorship U.S. client regime. But in the light of the regular sadistic treatment of women by these terrorist forces, the reference to the traditional rule of chivalry, now broken, can only inspire amazement about the nature of our friends and wonder about the moral and intellectual values of a country where these words can appear. Meanwhile, peasants continue to be beaten to death and mutilated. Women and children are being killed in indiscriminate army attacks, and police torture remains a routine practice. In November 1983, in a leaked cable that the Reagan administration attempted to conceal, the International Committee of the Red Cross cabled that has seen in continuing deterioration in the treatment of detainees since April. Perhaps as many as 90% of detainees are being tortured during interrogation. Torture is being employed in some of the formerly more humane centers, such as those run by the National Police. As torture increased, Reagan offered his ritual presidential certification, July 1983, describing the process of the government in ending torture and other human rights abuses, accepted by a supine Congress and public opinion fairly generally. U.S. Congress, President Reagan, they all were, fine with torture. They were fine with torture They said that, we're going to, progress and end torture and human rights, but only for, the white frauds of America. Nobody else, none of the great third world peoples of Asia, Latin America, and Africa are privy to such privilege as the United States racist, white, angry, vigilante lynch mobs in Congress, and the United States racist president and chief sadist and butcher in residence, Ronald Reagan, during the El Salvadoran years. 2 years later, the Salvadoran Commission of Human Rights stated that torture in El Salvador has become customary as a method of work considered natural and necessary by those who practice it. An American Watch report based on interviews in January 1985 recorded the testimony of refugees who fled well after President Duarte's theoretical strict rules about aerial bombardment were announced in September 1984 in response to protests by human rights groups. They fled, they say, because people can't stand so much bombing. The task of these people is to destroy, one said. The soldiers set the mountains on fire to drive people out of the hills, where they destroy villages and fields. They kill anyone they find, the refugees report. Not even chickens or pigs escape, as the scorched earth policies devastate crops and livestock and habitations, along with trapped civilians. Colonel Sigfredo Ochoa, who has many massacres to his credit and is much admired here for his prowess, told a reporter in January 1985 that he had established 12 free fire zones in Chalatenango, where airstrikes and artillery bombardments are being carried out indiscriminately. Without a civilian base of support, the guerrillas are nothing but outlaws, he explained. Ochoa refused to permit the International Red Cross to provide humanitarian services and ban medical services throughout the province, also blocking entry of food provided by the Catholic relief agency Caritas. His troops usually do not engage in combat with rebels, Chris Norton reports, but Roman Catholic Church sources say he dislodged some 1,400 civilian rebel supporters who fled to Honduras refugee camps between September and November 1984. These civilians says he turned mortar fire on them. Ochoa says there are no civilians in these areas, adding that we are anti-communist, democratic, or at least aspire to be that, and we believe in the market system. We represent the Judeo-Christian Western civilization. We defend a system. We need a leader, someone to lead us. It's this way in Latin America. We want a strong man, someone to lead us, to guide us. He runs the area like his private country, according to Observer with the human rights groups, who echoes views fairly widely held there, while receiving much praise from his U.S. white racist advisors for his successes. In the Guazapa area, where Dr. Clemente had worked, regular air attacks against civilian targets continued after Duarte's rules of engagement were unannounced. The scattered remnants of the population attempt to hide from ground sweeps following the shelling and bombardment by helicopters and jet bombers, watching their children die of starvation and thirst. In Cabanas, 2 months after Duarte's pronouncement, one man reported that about 15 people got killed, children, pregnant women, adults, etc., by 837 planes and helicopters. Earlier, soldiers had swept through raping, cutting the throats of their victims, killing children with knives. If they find somebody, they kill it. They even kill the poor dogs and other animals, another refugee testified, reporting night bombings, an effective terror technique now possible thanks to the U.S. Air Force technology and aerial support, and ambushing the people fleeing in October 1984. The soldiers also destroyed crops and houses, even pans one uses to cook in order to leave one without anything. Fleeing women and children were killed by bullets and grenades, or sliced to pieces and decapitated by machetes. The attacks became particularly vicious after the peace negotiations between Duarte and the guerrillas, Duarte's noble and courageous peace initiative, as the press described it, referring to Duarte's acceptance of long-standing guerrilla proposals, which then refused to pursue further. America's Watch reports that the testimonies they reproduced were not selected because the events they described were more or less horrifying than those described in other testimony presented in extensive detail in the monthly reports of the Church Human Rights Office to tell illegal, but ignored by the media. Rather, they are representatives of what is endured constantly by Salvadoran conflicts in American zones and guerrilla-controlled zones. The America's Watch report correctly warns that refugees' testimony must be critically evaluated. In fact, on the rare occasion occasions that U.S. journalists investigate massacre reports, they are cautious and scrupulous in presenting and evaluating testimony. For example, in the September investigation of James Lemoyne of July 1984 massacre at Los Lanitos, carried out by the United States trained elite Atlacato Battalion, who killed 68 people, according to the on-the-spot investigation of Tutela Legal a few days after the massacre, most of them women, old people, and children. The bodies were then burned with gasoline brought in by the helicopter. Lemoyne writes that the villagers' account has not been confirmed, and it may be encolored by their sympathies for the guerrillas. That which would count as confirmation, he does not say. And it is, of course, the norm for reports of atrocities to come from the victims, who are not likely to be sympathetic to the murderers of their families and friends. But to raise doubts on this score is permissible only in the case of atrocities conducted by an American white racist dictatorship U.S. client state, atrocities that are generally ignored or described with much skepticism and with the U.S. role pointedly omitted, as in this case. The need for care is regularly emphasized by analysts concerned with the facts and regularly disregarded, often with reckless abandon. Then there are ideologic points to be scored. In the case of El Salvador, the record compiled by human rights groups and journalists, many of them foreigner reporting out of the mainstream, is so extensive, detailed, and consistent that exercising all the care that is deemed appropriate in the case of our own state or its clients, no rational person can doubt that we are implicated in these terrible crimes. No one who surveys the record can reasonably doubt the conclusion of Ariadne Nair of America's Watch and Helsinki Watch. Gross abuses of human rights are not incidental to the way the armed forces of El Salvador conduct their war against the guerrillas. In our view, the principal reason that these abuses continue at such a high rate at a point when one would guess the armed forces should have run out of politically suspect persons to murder is that murders instill terror. Terror is the means whereby the armed forces maintain their authority. As for the still more massive atrocities of the ground and air war in the countryside, there is little reason for the armed forces of President Duarte, who presides over the worst massacre in the history of his country, to be overly concerned. The paymasters will be pleased, whatever the cost, if the results are satisfactory. And most of the U.S. population knows little more than the citizens of Moscow to do about Afghanistan. It is by the goodness of God, Mark Twain observed, that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Terrorist violence is rarely purposeless. When its goals have been attained, it may well subside. The urban assassinations declined in El Salvador after the successful use of terror to subdue the urban population, a fact explained here to justify further support for the torturers and assassins who are seen to be mending their ways. Similarly, we can expect with some confidence that sooner or later the terror of the countryside will abate once the resisting population is decimated or has fled or has been forcibly removed to areas where they can be controlled. Under Colonel Ochoa's rule, there will be many fewer atrocities. As a point of logic, atrocities require victims, and those that occur will be more difficult to document. If Charles Clement were to return to Guazapa, he would not report horrors and atrocities of the kind witnessed a few years ago, because the continuing bombardment around Guazapa, driven almost by all of the few hundred civilians remaining to flee to the camps or hiding elsewhere, refugees and relief workers say. That is, those who have not been murdered or removed by the army. Relief workers near Guazapa say they observed planes bombing the mountainside at least once a week in January 1985, though they saw rarely air fire while troops fighting on the ground, the only circumstance which is permitted according to the highly touted Duarte rules of engagement. Since the civilians have been killed or removed, the press can inform us things are looking up. American and Salvadoran human rights groups in El Salvador have not reported any incidents this year, 1985, in which Air Force caused large number of civilian casualties. The last conclusion is plainly true as a point of logic with regard to the main human rights monitor in the hemisphere, America's Watch, since its most recent report was based on testimony taken in January 1985. It is highly misleading at best with regard to other human rights groups. 2 weeks before the conclusion was quoted, appeared in the Council of Hemispheric Affairs in Washington, reported that according to its sources in El Salvador, the most accurate figure is that close to 3,000 civilians have died in rural areas in the first half of 1985 as a result of the air war. As for major human rights groups in El Salvador, the church-based Tutela Legal, COHA reports that unremitting public and private pressure on Tutela Legal by the Salvadoran government and the U.S. Embassy, which has documented by America's Watch, has caused it to adopt a lower profile and a much stricter evidential standards, which are difficult to meet under such restricted and dangerous circumstances. And the figures that it reports are but a fraction of the total death count, as Tutela personnel will freely admit. Since the press regularly avoids the topic and virtually never reports the finding of church or other human rights groups in El Salvador, further check is difficult, but sooner or later, such conclusions about declining body counts are bound to be correct, such as Soviet atrocity based in Hungary after 1956, sure proof that the benign intent of the forces had been intervened to defend Hungary from fascists instigated by the United States. It is notable that in El Salvador, as in Nicaragua, the level of atrocities which rival the most gruesome of recent years increased dramatically as U.S. involvement grew. For few seem capable of drawing the obvious conclusions. They would be plain enough in the case of the official enemy. Events in Nicaragua and El Salvador since 1980s, as reviewed in sections 2 and 3, illustrate the second of the major consequences that characteristically ensue in U.S. domains when efforts are made to mitigate miseries of traditional life. We return in chapter 3 to the remarkable reaction on the part of the media and educated classes fairly generally to what is taking place in these countries. Challenge and response: Guatemala. The conditions of traditional life came under threat in Guatemala at about the same time they did in El Salvador, and for the same reasons. Larger segments of the great Hispanic peasant population, Indians primarily, began to lend support to guerrillas after the government moved to crush the nonviolent efforts to overcome the conditions of semi-slavery and misery to which the United States has made notable and persisting contributions. The dynamics were familiar ones. Local self-help organizations, many established by the church, had developed during the 1970s and functioned effectively with wide participation by the rural population, achieving impressive results and calling forth the usual response: murder of priests and commonly leaders, and generalized massacre and repression. The response has been examined in gory detail by human rights groups. In October 1982, Amnesty International reported that in widespread massacres, the government had destroyed entire villages, tortured and mutilated local people, and carried out mass executions. To cite one example, in one village, troops forced all the inhabitants into the courthouse, raped the women and beheaded the men, and then battered the children to death against rocks in a nearby river. A Survival International delegation took depositions from refugees in Mexico who report massacres in which pregnant women and children had been killed, women had been raped, and people had been tortured and burned alive, with the destruction of whole towns and villages, burning of crops, and destruction of livestock. The stories are the familiar ones from the domains of U.S. influence and control. The mother of two children fled in her village as it was burned down by many killed by the army. In July 1982, soldiers flew into the area by helicopter. First, they went to a nearby town and killed 5 people, burned the town, and threw people, including women and children, into the flames. Children's throats were cut and women were hit by machetes. A man watched as his soldiers killed 15 people, including women, with machetes. They set fire to the houses and sometimes opened doors of huts and threw hand grenades inside. In all, 50 people in his village were killed. Soldiers also killed 9 people in the nearby town of Blank, which they burned as well. From a kilometer away, he saw women from the village who were hung by their feet without clothes and left. So you can see the U.S. government, this is their Guatemalan regime in 1982. The angry white butchers, the racist lynch mob vigilantes of Washington, throats cut, children cut, throw the alive people into the big fire, decapitate them, burn them alive, burn the town, burn the crops, burn all of this stuff, starve the people, the standard stuff, the U.S. white racist American congressional and presidential dictatorship, the genocidal dictatorship that we call the United States of America. Others described how villagers were hacked to death by machetes, beaten to death, raped and tortured by soldiers, their towns burned to the ground. The perpetrators of such wide massacres were easily recognized as Guatemalan army forces by their uniforms and their Israeli Gale rifles, standard issue for straight terrorists in Latin America. Survivors of the massacre at Finca in San Francisco in July 1982 described how 300 people were killed, the women raped and shot and burned in ashes, houses put to the torch, the old people hacked to pieces with machetes, the children disemboweled. Finally, they brought out the last child. He was a little one, maybe 2 or 3 years old. They stabbed him and cut out his stomach. The little child was screaming, but because he wasn't dead yet, a soldier grabbed a thick, hard stick and bashed his head. They held his feet apart, his feet together, and smashed him against a tree trunk. I saw how they flung him hard and hurt his head. It split open, and they threw him inside the house. The 1982 strategy of the Rios Montt regime, defended by President Reagan and his human rights specialist, Elliot Abrams, as we shall see, was described at the time by a respected journal. The army strategy is to clear the population out of guerrilla support areas. Troops and militia move into the villages, shoot, burn, or behead the inhabitants they catch. The survivors are machine gunned from helicopters as they flee. 2 years later, a British parliamentary investigation concluded that, if anything, the situation has worsened since 1983 in a continuing slaughter that the Conservative Bishops' Conference describes as a genocide. The grim statistics summarizing Guatemala's political reality: 100,000 killed since 1960, 100 political assassinations in 1984, a month in 1984, 10 disappearances a week, 100,000 orphans, 500,000 displaced, barely reached the North American, let alone European newspapers. Government claims that the guerrillas are responsible and that the disappeared have gone to Cuba or the USSR is a brazen lie. The evidence points inexorably to the state security apparatus as being responsible for these crimes. Presenting the testimony of gruesome murder and torture, the report cites estimates that in most recent series of state massacres, some 25,000 had been slaughtered, mostly Indians. The 3 departments where a census was taken, the Roman Catholic Church administrator in the town of Quiche, estimates that in recent years, about 20,000 Indians have been killed in Quiche province alone, the Wall Street Journal reports, quoting another churchman who says, "The roads began to stink. There were so many dead bodies." Estimates are uncertain because the atrocities in the rural areas generally go unreported, as in El Salvador. The remnants of the terrorized population are removed to model villages. The British report continues, where the system implanted by means of terror is designed to sow terror. Conditions there, including the forced civilian patrols, into which virtually the entire male population is press-ganged, can be compared to slavery. Apart from the slaughter, eviction of the peasants to make way for the agro-export crops is bound to increase the already dramatic levels of severe malnutrition. The planned elections seem more designed for the consumption by U.S. Congress and world opinion than for the Guatemalan people. The model villages are inspired by the strategic hamlet programs applied by the United States in the early stages of its direct attack in South Vietnam, when an attempt was made to drive several million people into areas where they could be protected from the guerrillas, who the aggressors conceded they were willingly supporting. The basic concept was expressed in a U.S. aid report of 1963. The ultimate target is the human mind. It may be changed, it may be rendered impotent for expression, or it may be distinguished, but it still remains the critical target. This was during the hearts and minds period of the American-U.S. war against the rural population in South Vietnam, later to be modified in favor of mass murder as more efficient given the resources of the U.S. military forces. The Guatemalan army, with its Israeli advisors, is regarded as better suited to the task than the U.S. client forces in South Vietnam hence capable of applying these ideas more effectively. As the London Economist noted in 1983, with the help of Israeli advisors, Guatemala has succeeded where a similar campaign in neighboring El Salvador, pushed by American advisors, has failed, though the price of success has become high, including sadistic butchery and 1 million homeless Indians. The journal suggests that El Salvador could copy the techniques used in Guatemala with profit. A few months earlier, the same journal had thoroughly observed that what liberal Americans can reasonably expect is that a condition of military help to Guatemala can be easing of the political persecution of the center, which played into the hands of the extreme left in the first place. The others evidently deserve their fate. The same strategic amulets model to be applied in El Salvador as well. Colonel Ochoa announced the formation of auto defense units that will involve the whole community, including women in the defense of the community. Noting that the plans similar to this have worked in neighboring Guatemala, no one will be paid for their services, he said. Though when the communities are organized, they will receive government services and jobs. Funding is to come from U.S. aid and the Inter-American Bank. Like the Guatemalan counterparts, Ochoa cites the Israeli Kitzbutzin as an example elsewhere, as he has credited his training in Israel for his achievements. The whole account is straight out of Orwell, but as in Guatemala, the results will not be amusing for this enslaved population. The Reagan administration and human rights. I'm going to just look at throughout the administration has produced a steady stream of apologetics for the murderers and torturers, while conceding that in the past there had been the abuses that have now been overcome. Rios Montt, who took over the slaughter in March 1982, was totally committed to democracy, man of great personal integrity, who wants to improve the quality of life for all Guatemalans, and had received a bum rap, so President Reagan commented in December 1982, at a time when human rights groups and the international press estimated that some 3,000 to 8,000 had been killed, with 200,000 driven from their homes by the government of this saintly figure who, speaking on Guatemalan TV, had declared a state of siege so that we could kill legally. A few months earlier, after 4 months of mounting atrocities under Rios Montt, Stephen Bosworth of the State Department had informed Congress that the record of the past 4 months, while not perfect, demonstrates that the new government has a commitment to positive change and new opportunity in Guatemala. I cannot emphasize strongly enough the favorable contrast between the current human rights situation in Guatemala and the situation last December under the Lucius Garcia regime. He added falsely that under the previous government, we did not provide military assistance because of the human rights record. But now, given the dramatic improvements, we may perceive. Melvin Luvitsky of the State Department Human Rights Office told Congress that under the Lucas Garcia regime, the U.S. could not easily sustain a relationship because it engaged in violence against its own people. During the Lucas Garcia regime, the administration had sung a different tune, lauding a mass murder for positive developments, as Guatemalan security forces have been taking care to protect innocent bystanders. During their counterinsurgency operations, they were actually engaged in wholesale murder and torture of civilians, and lauding also the Army's program of civic action in backward areas. General Mejia Victorias took over from Rios Montt in another coup. It turned out that Rios Montt hadn't been quite such a saint after all. The State Department Human Rights Report conceded that under his rule, there were many allegations of abuses against the Guatemalan Indian population, some of which were confirmed, a forthright denunciation. Reagan-Abrams style of past abuses of sort briefly reviewed earlier. Now, however, the situation has improved, the administration alleged. Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights Elliott Abrams added that the violence and refugees should be blamed on the guerrillas who are fighting the government. Violence and refugees are the price of stability. As for the refugees in Mexico, their testimony can be discounted. Abrams held because some of the maybe guerrilla sympathizers. In any event, they are not representative proportions of the population. Reporting on events in Guatemala without stepping foot into the country is not recommended, Abrams explained. Naturally enough, since it is only the refugee camps that testimony can be taken freely without fear of the state terrorist. In congressional testimony in May 1984, Abrams stated that General Mejia Victorias had continued a large number of the human rights improvements that Rios Montt had begun, thus expressing his admiration for the most savage of the thugs who have raised Guatemala with U.S. support. State Department human rights reports and government officials claim constant improvements, even dramatic decline in violence as government atrocities soared, or blame the guerrillas when evidence of atrocity could not be denied. In September 1983, as the rate of assassinations doubled, the abductions quadrupled to 100 under a month, 100 per month. America's Watch observes, as State Department officials said, that we see a trend toward improvement of human rights. In March 1985, Edward Fox of the State Department stated that democracy is on track in Guatemala. The overall human rights situation in Guatemala has also improved, and the trends are encouraging. While human rights groups are now even the press reported the upsurge in murders and repression in preparation for forthcoming elections. Commenting on his abysmal record, Christopher Hitchens observed, "I'm not suggesting moral equivalence here. The U.S. government has fallen below the standards employed by the cheapest Stalinist hack." After the disappearance and murder of several U.S. aid employees, Abrams conceded that some people had arisen. It has not gone from white to black, but the situation has clearly deteriorated. The reports sampled above are from the period when the situation was still perfect. In the case of El Salvador, Abrams stated categorically that well-documented massacres, such as the Los Llanitos, had never taken place, referring to this in another massacre by the Atlacatel Battalion at the Guasilgo River, where the toll may have reached several hundred. Abrams stated that neither of them happened. There were no massacres in El Salvador in 1984. Abrams also claimed that the U.S. Embassy, which is in a better position than a newspaper, which has a one-man bureau to investigate what is going on in El Salvador, always investigated such reports, and that his memory is that they did so in these cases, finding the reports groundless. The U.S. Embassy denied investigating either massacre. We return in Chapter 3 to interesting reactions of President Duarte in these and other cases. It is a small wonder that human rights groups have referred to the Reagan administration as an apologist for some of the worst horrors of our time. Human Rights Secretary Abrams has become particularly notorious for his denials of human rights violations or apologetics for them in Central America and Turkey particularly, and for his attacks in the familiar style of the Stalinist models on human rights advocates. In recognition of his achievements in protecting human rights, Abrams was placed in charge of the Latin American affairs in the State Department. Reagan's diversion to human rights saw clear before his accession to the presidency, which permitted him to put into practice in 1978 when the mass murders of Argentina generals had become an international scandal. He condemned the Carter administration for raising a fuss about such trivialities. In the process of rounding out hundreds of suspected terrorists, the Argentine authorities have no doubt locked up a few innocent people, he wrote. This problem they should correct without delay. The incarceration of a few innocents, however, is no reason they should open the jails and let the terrorists run free. True to his commitments, he and Jean Kirkpatrick quickly let the murderers know that such concerns were a thing of the past after the 1980 election. So just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. 1 second. I'm going to just take a 1 minute break and I'll be right back. Okay, the contribution of the mercenary states. Since the advent of the Reagan administration, the U.S. has provided direct military assistance to Guatemala, first in roundabout ways, then more directly, helping to facilitate the torture, murder, and general brutality. The U.S. government has not, however, been able to participate in the genocidal activities of its Guatemalan friends as fully as it would have liked because of congressional human rights restrictions. Nevertheless, contrary to what is commonly alleged, the delivery of arms to the colonial murderers of the U.S. regime never ceased, and as Pentagon figures show, it was barely below the norm during the Carter years. Still, there were impediments, so prime responsibility, providing the means and the advice and the instruction, was shifted to various clients, particularly Argentine neo-Nazis, though this ally was lost after the unfortunate return to democracy in Argentina and Israel, which has lent its service enthusiastically to the cases of fact commonly suppressed here. The occasional articles and editorials on Guatemalan horrors in the press commonly refer to the travail of the years since 1954, without realizing the overthrow of Guatemalan democracy in 1954 and the regular U.S. intervention since to maintain the system instituted by the CIA coup, a sort of display of moral cowardice. So you can see basically the last 3 to 4 sections indicate the U.S. government, the colonial butchers in El Salvador and Guatemala. They conducted a campaign of colonial extermination of the great Hispanic and indigenous Indians of El Salvador and Guatemala. It was a ruthless campaign by the white vigilante racist butchers of the United States of America. An angry group of sadistic, cruel, detached, genocidal, racist American white butchers. Continuing on. The U.S., of course, is implicated in the activities of its colonial clients. The Argentine neo-Nazis regularly served as proxies for the U.S. and Latin America, a fact noted without shame. And more generally, the U.S. was instrumental into the rise and sustenance of the neo-fascist national security states of South America, of the U.S. neo-colonial regime, as was the case of the USSR in Argentina. But there are also other links extending from Nazi Germany to Central America via the United States, to which we return in Chapter 4. In the case of Israel, U.S. responsibility is obvious, given the massive aid Israel receives from the United States, conditioned in part on the services that it is expected to provide in return. The fact is recognized in Israel. Journalist Yoav Carney notes that the Israelis may be seen as American proxies in Honduras and Guatemala. In discussing the Memorandum of Understanding with the U.S. regarding strategic cooperation, the well-informed correspondent Gidon Samet writes that its most important features have to do with the Middle East, but with the Central America and Africa. Israeli services to the U.S. and the Third World, he adds, were the prime topic of discussion when Israel's representative David Kamichi visited Washington in early summer 1983. The U.S. needs Israel in Africa and Latin America, among other reasons, because of the government's difficulties in obtaining congressional authorization for its ambitious aid programs and naturally for military actions. Israel aided the U.S. through its contacts with Zaire and Chad, and the U.S. has long been interested in using Israel as a pipeline for military and other aid to Central America. U.S. aid to Israel diverted to Central America can thus serve indirectly to bypass congressional restrictions. There are among the secrets relating to U.S.-Israeli contacts with regard to Central America. Furthermore, the administration requires support from congressional liberals for Grenada and other adversaries, and for the Israeli connection can help materially here, given Israel's influence in Congress. The Washington correspondent of the Jerusalem Post elaborates, referring to criticism of Israel for selling weapons to various Latin American regimes, many of which are not exactly democratic or enlightened. Israeli officials have countered by pointing out that most of the sales have had the blessings of the Reagan administration, which has often been frustrated by Congress in its arms sales to these countries. Israel, therefore, could legitimately argue that it was doing America's dirty work and making a nice profit in the process. The profits are not insignificant. The Israeli press reports that Latin America has become the leading market for Israeli arms exports, estimated at $1.2 billion for 1982, and that the market should grow in light of the effectiveness of Israeli arms in the Lebanon war. The U.S. is secretly helping Israel to establish military relations with various states, according to U.S. sources, and is encouraging Israel to use American aid to assist U.S. clients so that they can act in effect to obtain Israeli arms with U.S. funding. Former Knesset member Michael Kleiner states that the sale of arms to Honduras and to El Salvador, arms which indirectly find their way to the war against Nicaragua, are made in accordance with the explicit request of the United States. Not surprisingly, Israeli arms sales to Latin America rapidly increased when the congressional human rights restrictions took effect. Shortly after Israel agreed to provide military aid to Guatemala, the Guatemala's Army Staff College Review published a prominent feature article by a Guatemalan officer in praise of Adolf Hitler, National Socialism, and the Final Solution, in which the author, a Guatemalan military officer, quoted extensively from Mein Kampf and traced Hitler's anti-Semitism to his discovery that communism was part of a Jewish conspiracy, so that Germany's fight against the Jews was in self-defense as part of its struggle against Russia, which was dominated by the strength of the Marxist Jewish nucleus. Despite his admiration for Hitler, he added that Nazism is not a political panacea and urged that Guatemala find its own variant of National Socialism, similar to the fascist Spanish Falange, which is eminently nationalistic and Catholic. Neither such sentiments nor the genocidal uses to which the military was put cut short the flow of Israeli weapons and advisors. Israeli military assistance was estimated at $90 million by 1982 when Rios Montt regime took power, offering thanks to the Israeli training which made this possible. Israel's close relations with the Argentine neo-Nazis and others like them in Latin America were also unaffected by their virulent anti-Semitism. To cite one numerous example of regular cozy relations, when Israel faced an international arms embargo after the 1967 war, it approached Bolivia with a plan which was implemented to divert Israel and Belgian and Swiss arms ostensibly destined for Bolivia to be transported by a company managed by Klaus Barbie, the Nazi war criminal who was spirited to Latin America by U.S. intelligence when it was no longer possible to benefit from his services in post-war Europe. A report in the Israeli press alleges that Barbie also had frequent dealings with Israel concerning supplies of Israeli arms to Latin American countries and various underground organizations. Any possible moral qualms concerning arms sale to Guatemalan Himmlers and other murderers and torturers may be put aside by the familiar principles expressed by the director of Israeli state industry, TAS, Michael Schur. The welfare of our people in the state supersedes all other considerations. If the state has decided in favor of export, my conscience is clear. Some do feel a degree of discomfort. The revered moralist Ellis Whistle, whose thoughts are featured in the media whenever deemed appropriate to denounce someone else's crimes, received a letter from the Nobel Prize laureate containing documentation on Israel's contribution to the atrocities in Guatemala, with the suggestion that he might use the prestige and close Israeli contacts to help mitigate genocidal acts while they are in progress. The matter came up in an interview in the Israeli press, Weisel cited, and said that he had not responded. I usually answer at once, but what I can answer to him to make a public statement would violate his principle, frequently expressed never to say anything in public critical of Israel, but he did sigh. So you could see the U.S. government, the white, angry, sadistic butchers of, genocidal proportions, the sadists and cruel, detached butchers of Washington. They created a mass murder state in El Salvador and Guatemala. No problem whatsoever. The U.S. Congress and the sadist and genocidal butcher-in-chief, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, both, carried this through to completion. The great Hispanic and the great Asian peoples against which they, launched their third world racist white initiative by the U.S. government, lynchmob vigilante whites of America. The planning of state terror, the striking correlation between U.S. assistance and barbarism in Central America has its roots in deliberate planning, both in global terms and in application to this region. We will take up these matters later on, merely noting here that the essentials are understood in Washington, however easy it may be disguise this reality with familiar pieties. The U.S. aid report of 1967, reviewing the U.S. program to train the National Guard and National Police, commented that by virtue of this assistance, authorities have been successful in handling any politically motivated demonstrations in recent years. With the political danger that exists in a densely populated country with a rich or very rich and poor, extremely poor, El Salvador is fortunate that the Grand and police are well trained and disciplined. Here it is necessary to decode once again. From Newspeak to English, it is not El Salvador that is fortunate plainly, but rather those who own and rule the country, those whom we dare not disturb by trying to inhibit their pleasure in torture and mass murder. After its successful destruction of Guatemalan democracy in 1954, the U.S. undertook to ensure that no such problem would ever arise again. The U.S. began to train army officers and security forces, including elements of the police specializing in political repression and the mobile military police, later implicated in many massacres. The goal was to increase efficiency in the operations that are bound to be necessary as the miseries of traditional life and continued repression evoke resistance, and to ensure that domestic order will be maintained, even if some pretense of formal democracy is occasionally permitted for the benefit of the U.S. home front. After the CIA coup, Lefebvre notes, U.S. advisors took a ragtag force and converted it into an efficient modern army with institutional pride and allegiance and an understanding of its political as well as its military mission. A fit force to rule the country, the U.S. determined again in 1963 when Kennedy supported a military coup. Similarly, in Honduras, the army, not yet a self-conscious professional institution, could do little to block social and political development in earlier years, but is currently more capable of doing so. Now that U.S. training raised the military's self-awareness and North America's equipment made it the decisive political force. As America Watch observes, what the United States is doing for this army of El Salvador today, it did for the army of Guatemala 20 years ago, and there's every reason to expect the long-term consequences to be the same. The major step in providing the Latin American military and internal security forces with an understanding of their political mission and with the proficiency to realize it were taken under the Kennedy administration, in part through the Alliance for Progress. We return to the topic in chapters 3 and 4. The model for these programs was Nicaragua, where in the late 1920s, the U.S. undertook to create an efficient domestic military force to replace the U.S. Marines who occupied the country for 2 decades. The result was that Nicaragua was clearly a nation occupied by its own army, one of the most totally corrupt military establishments in the world, maintained with enthusiastic white U.S. establishment support from the days of FDR to the fall of Somoza. Guatemala's turn came in the 50s, after early steps in the Alliance for the Progress, El Salvador is undergoing the same process today, with Honduras not far behind. Costa Rica has been spared the fate of the other Central American countries, largely because it has no professional army to occupy the country in the interests of the generals, the oligarchs, and their foreign overseers. But the general administration is working hard to overcome this defect while laboring to restore the traditional system in Nicaragua. Lester Langley observes that the Costa Ricans, who have suffered no American military penetration and only isolated cases of Washington's political chastisement, and are the only truly pro-American people in Central America, elite groups aside, with a little help from their friends in Washington. This should soon change as Costa Rica goes the way of the rest of Central America. The current pro-American mood in Costa Rica derives not only from the lack of U.S. intervention and the sensible rejection until recently of substantial U.S.-trained domestic armed forces, but also from the fact that the Costa Rican economy is in shambles, with one of the highest per capita debts in the world, and 3/4 of its exports used to cover debts to foreign, primarily U.S. banks, so that the economy remains viable only because it is rolling in aid from Uncle Sam, receiving the highest per capita aid of any country apart from Israel. That this year's aid of $198 million equals the total of U.S. support for Costa Rica in the 18 years before the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Wall Street Journal comments, quoting a leader in Costa Rican figure who says that our best industry is the Sandinistas, as the U.S. works to shore up its anti-Nicaraguan alliance. We're recycling money from the U.S. government and paying it out to U.S. banks, the president of the Central Bank of Costa Rica observes. In other words, the U.S. taxpayer is paying U.S. banks via the aid program, permitting Costa Rica to combine bankruptcy with relative prosperity as long as it toes the line. A secret State Department report of May 1984 urges military aid to Costa Rica to prevent any backsliding into neutralism and to push it more explicitly and publicly into the anti-Sandinista camp. The report notes that for public relations, it is important to neutralize the ARDE factor, referring to the U.S.-supported counterattacks from Costa Rica. This will weaken the rationale for a vigorous U.S. response to Nicaraguan military actions. Our provision of assistance and accompanying public and background statements can help to focus the spotlight on Costa Rica as the victim of Nicaraguan aggression. The Washington Post quoted a Costa Rican close to President Monge saying that he had tried to handle border incidents by diplomatic means, but was being pushed to create a scandal by the United States. The State Department report warned that the danger as an effective rationale for urgent U.S. military supplies could be dissipated somewhat if there are no further attacks, and press stories focus on mediation and lessen tensions. Attacks against a small democracy with no standing army put Nicaragua in a bad light. Costa Rica had in the past sought to diffuse tensions, avoid confrontation, and fall back on moral protection of its unarmed neutrality, the report continues. A course that still retains its strong attraction for many Costa Ricans. The course must be changed, with the U.S. exploring incidents arising from the Contra attacks to make it appear that Costa Rica is the victim of unprovoked Nicaraguan aggression, whatever the consequences in Costa Rica. So you can see the white racist U.S. government, genocidal, vigilante, lynch mob butchers of the United States, the American butchers. They planned state terror. They planned successful planting of, puppet regimes. There were colonial puppet regimes in Guatemala and Nicaragua, and they, basically ruled with a terror murder, combination. And, the great Hispanic and indigenous peoples of Latin America, were murdered, were slaughtered, were tortured, were terrorized by the white racist American vigilante lynch mob butchers. Their campaigns included, basically setting up state terror, the media frauds, the academic quacks of the American, mass media, as well as the American academia frauds at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all of the Ivy League schools. They all got together and, promoted this genocidal campaign by the U.S. government. The miseries of traditional life, a final note. This review, which barely samples what the U.S. has helped to institute and maintain in Central America, is seriously misleading in one crucial respect. It overlooks the silent suffering of normal violence, the violence to the spirit and to the flesh described by the lay minister quoted earlier. In Honduras, for example, 1 in 8 infants dies before age 2, and of those who survive to age 5, 3/4 are undernourished. The problem is not that food production is insufficient in 1980, Oxfam reports. The harvest of bananas was 3 times greater than the harvest of corn, rice, sorghum, and beans combined, while Honduras has become the net importer of all of these staple foods. Coffee, beef, cotton, fruit, and palm oil are major export crops, enriching U.S. agribusiness and the tiny elite of Hondurans who are junior partners with U.S.-based agribusiness companies. Beef production more than doubled since 1960, while per capita consumption of beef declined and exports increased over 500% for hamburgers, hot dogs, and pet foods in the U.S. Forests are being destroyed for cattle ranching with the assistance of U.S. aid grant funding, the expansions of beef production for export. In one typical region, 68% of loans from U.S. government and private sources went to cattle ranchers, 22% to cotton growers, 5% to farmers. Peasants are compelled to clear land which they farm for 2 or 3 years, after which they are forced to move on to repeat the process while the land loses its fertility and becomes a weeded, dusty wasteland from overgrazing. While Central America was expanding beef production rapidly under the Alliance for Progress, beef consumption dropped 41% in Costa Rica, 38% in El Salvador, and 13% in Guatemala and Nicaragua from the 1960s to the mid-1970s. When the land is finally denuded and devastated, we may tolerate the victory of some future guerrilla movement, then denouncing its failure to carry out real economic development, another proof of the evils of communism. The process extends back many years in Central America to the Spanish conquest. In fact, when grazing by cattle introduced by the conquerors, unrestricted under Spanish rule, was a factor in the elimination of close to 20 million people in about 50 years, a notable chapter in the history of genocide. The major factors that caused Honduras to lose the ability to feed its own people, the Oxfam report continues, include the economic power of the white American corporations, the interests of a small Honduran elite, and the policies of the United States and international banks and aid agencies, which have driven these developments throughout Central America. Just in the past few years, U.S. corporations, which have virtually owned Honduras since 1900, bribed Honduran officials to avoid paying taxes and hired Honduran army officers to bring troops to arrest members of a peasant cooperative who sought to evade their market control, while U.S. government policies are designed to guarantee their increasing profits. All of this is quite apart from the regular subversion and military intervention over the years. If the society held in thrall to the foreign investor threatens to change in the wrong direction towards concern for the needs of its own population. In part, these developments, it simply reflect the dynamics of the market given the distribution of economic power, with the fastest growing and most profitable markets for agricultural commodities located in the advanced capitalist countries. The most dynamic sector of capital accumulation is in export production, so it is here that modernization has taken place. Those who have only their labor to sell can expect to fall by the wayside or to be removed by force if they are in the way of greater profits. The state controlled by the US-backed oligarchy will naturally observe the same priorities. Thus, in Guatemala, 87% of all government credit in a decade following the military coup of 1963 went to finance export production. White rice, corn, and beans received only 3%. Had democratic elections been permitted in 1963, the story would likely have been different, but Kennedy-backed military coup prevented any such outcome. A similar pattern of government credit holds in Brazil and elsewhere. Throughout the Central American dominions of the United States, the same has been true, particularly under the Alliance for Progress, when U.S. aid to agriculture rapidly increased, not, however, to alleviate hunger, but primarily to improve the productivity of Central America's agricultural exporters, and at the same time to advance the sale of American companies that manufacture pesticide and fertilizer. Aid accepts as fundamental doctrine the notion that its funds should not be directed toward reducing food prices for domestic consumers. Langley observes, or for improving domestic food consumption. Quite the contrary, as aid disbursements show, its concern is the export market dominated by U.S. agribusiness, expansion of the market for American grain exporters as domestic production for food for the population declines, and improving opportunities for the foreign investor. An executive of the U.S. fertilizer firm observed that there would be scarcely any U.S. investment if it were not for the infrastructure, the education, the training, and the support provided by our aid programs. Very few investors would be in any of the underdeveloped countries were it not for our effort at economic assistance. And as noted, the investment is not for the benefit of the population. In fact, it is harmful for them, despite the statistics concerning production increase. For Food and Peace Programs, PL 480, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture described in 1982 as one of the United States' most successful market development tools, has opened up new markets for U.S. grain producers, allowing them to export more than $20 billion worth of grain under the program. Furthermore, as explained President Carter's Secretary of Agriculture, John Block, explained, food is a weapon that we use to tie countries to us. That way they'll be reluctant to upset us. So starvation, it seems, is the mode of, just diplomatic dealings. Starvation, the U.S. government deals diplomatically in starvation terms with the great third world peoples of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The picture is the same throughout Latin America, where the terrifying reality is that most of the population is hungry, malnourished, and sick, while the actual purchasing power of the worker has been declining since the early 1960s. Despite impressive growth rates and economic miracles under the national security states that the U.S. has helped to impose and sustain, Latin America's net exporter of foods, including grains, meat, sugars, bananas, coffee, cacao, and soybeans, as well as non-food crops such as cotton, because the large landowners, foreign as well as domestic, earn handsome profits from such exports, more than they might earn selling food in the domestic market, as does U.S. agribusiness with its indirect state subsidies. At the same time, only about 10% of the ablaze land, arable land, is in use. Latin America is fully capable not only of feeding its own population well, but of contributing significantly to the world food supplies, and productivity surpassed Western technology, efficiency, and productivity. Particularly in the past quarter century, the United States has made material contribution to these consequences with its political, military, and economic policies ranging from subversion to quote-unquote aid. The phenomena is in fact worldwide. The U.S. is the world's largest food importer, primarily from the third world, including countries where malnutrition is rampant. The U.S. is also the world's largest exporter, but the food rarely goes to the starving. 2/3 of U.S. agricultural exports go to developed countries, primarily Europe and Japan. In 1982, the Netherlands alone received more of our agricultural products, over $3 billion worth, than the entire continent of Africa. And agricultural exports to Canada were twice as high as the 17 countries of the world, with a food supply of less than 2,000 calories per person, with a population of almost 1 billion people. Furthermore, 55% of the U.S. grain exports are for animals, much of it for beef exports to the U.S., and most of the food for third world governments is not aid. Only 3% was aid in 1982, but rather is sold with low interest financing, and hence is in effect a taxpayer subsidy of U.S. aggregate business, then for the most part resold at prices that the poor cannot afford.
40,000 children die every day from malnutrition and disease resulting from starvation. We help kill them with policies designed to have this predictable consequence. Let us now turn away from the children dying of malnutrition while crops are exported from the U.S., from the bodies hacked to pieces by machetes, and the villages burned to the ground from free fire, and consider the background for all of this at home. That's chapter 1. It's basically turning the tide, U.S. intervention in Central America and the struggle for peace, free world vignettes. It's available on my website. It's also going to be the first link of my, if you look in the description section, copy and paste the link. I will have it. It's my Google Drive link of this book that I have put on PDF because I'm going to be discussing this book completely. All the chapters are going to be covered. Every other day I'll be coming online and giving this probably 2.5 hour podcast to discuss it. You could see basically the U.S. racist, angry vigilante whites of Washington, their subjugation of the great ethnic third world peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America is because of their hate, the racist hate and racial purity issues that they have against the poor people and indigenous people. They attack the people in El Salvador. We discussed Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. We discussed both the murder campaigns, the U.S. funded and, appropriated murder campaigns, the neo-colonial regime of the United States and its murderous campaign in these places. And then we also discussed the Southeast Asian murder campaign in superficial, thoughts and in superficial ideas. So basically, I'm going to just finish with some background, the gruesomeness of these actions, of the U.S. government. It just goes to show their savage bestiality, the white bestial butchers of the United States. They don't stop at anything to cause, immense pain and suffering, murder, torture, and starvation for the ethnic great peoples of the third world. So basically, the white American vigilante lynch mob racist bestial butchers of Washington, genocidal murder campaign against the great Hispanic and great indigenous peoples of El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, as well as the great indigenous peoples of Asia, including Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, will be discussed in kind. White American vigilante racist lynch mob butchers of Washington and their European white racist partners participated in the criminal murder and hid the massacres of the El Salvadoran and the Nicaraguan and Guatemalan people for 50 plus years. This is similar to their murderous campaign against the great peoples of Asia. We will review today the scenes of white lynch mob racist vigilante dictatorships in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and discuss the European white fraud, U.S. mass media, and American academic media frauds in their coverage of their secretive white super racist politicians of Washington and their butcher campaigns against these great peoples. And we did review it. We did review basically the actions in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, as well as the racist American vigilante white dictatorships in these regions, and we discussed it. We discussed two presidents, Jimmy Carter, the racist American white vigilante butcher of Washington of 1976 to 1980, who enabled the Nicaraguan mass murderer Anastasia Somoza to commit genocide against the Nicaraguan peasants under the pretext of American quote-unquote human rights. We talked about the human rights, the quote-unquote human rights of Carter, which included cutting off women's breasts after being raped, removal of the bowels of women and men as well as their heart while they were still alive, slitting their throats while their family watched, pulling the tongue out of the person while their family watched, an execution-style Texas Ranger, American vigilante, shotgun to the back to their children while they watched. Children were bayoneted and infants were banged against rocks, we saw. Children were used as target practice, enduring repeated shootings in the back and gouging out of the human eyes and fingernails and then killing them. We saw all of that. The white racist, bestial, savage butchers of America pretended not to know these crimes, including the Washington Post, New York Times, and other U.S. mass media, being silent during this genocidal torture extravaganza. Carter continued to fund the aid, as we saw, to the Somoza regime and under the Duarte regime, under the quote-unquote human rights pretext, despite human rights calls by Amnesty International, American Red Cross, as well as Archbishop Romero, detailing the cruelty of the American white dictatorship in these places. The American white Roman Catholic agents of murderous butchery, Jimmy Carter, and the United States Congress allowed Archbishop Romero to be slaughtered at the hands of his mercenaries, despite his cries about terrorist atrocities by the El Salvadoran regime. We saw that the sadistic, cruel, detached American white racist Congress and Jimmy Carter, sadist in chief, were both fully aware and completely funding this white supremacy party in both El Salvador and Nicaragua. The Rios Montt colonial regime we saw, which was the American colonial regime in Guatemala, was backed by both Reagan and Carter, who are sadistic, white, cruel, detached American genocidal, bestial butchers, which allowed them to carry out rapes, burnings of Hispanics and indigenous Indians. Many hacked to death with machetes, and then their children were disemboweled. This is Jimmy Carter's quote-unquote human rights program, torture and terror, which is a common white American congressional and presidential approach to the great third world ethnic peoples, was used in lavish to cause immense suffering to the people, including the removal of ears of Hispanic and indigenous babies, nailing babies' hands to their heads to stop the moving infant head, cutting off arms and legs, and inducing paraplegia through gunshot wounds and neck snapping. The white American bestial racist murderous butchers of Washington also found it prestigious to do these things against these poor innocent people and promoted this genocidal butcher Jimmy Carter as a beacon of American prestige for the Nobel Prize. The racist whites of America and Europe are complicit in allowing this mass murder of third world peoples to prestige. America is only a rogue state and a pariah state. When America needs to do something, it calls on the mafia to break people's bones. Similarly, it calls on its military to break people's spines and cut people's arms off. These are American white vigilante lynch mob thugs. Also, the white colonial American dictatorship of Guatemala. We discussed the regime that waged war against the civilian population and residential population through bombings of its own people. Thousands were killed in this way. There was also economic exploitation, slavery and sexual slavery, starvation and famine, and American white capitalist control of the country's resources was the guide for this genocidal campaign by the United States. The people were in abject poverty and misery. These campaigns compare pretty similar to the white American colonial dictatorship in Indonesia. Probably the biggest mass murderer ever was General Suharto between 1965 and 1968, who was a genocidal butcher supported by the white vigilante lynch mob butcher Lyndon B. Johnson, as well as the lynch mob butchers of U.S. Congress between 1965 and 1969. The American white racist politicians of Washington could not come to grips with sovereignty in Southeast Asia by Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Indochina, Korea, or even Japan, similar to that in their Central and South Americas, as the grand area, quote unquote, a place for American capitalist white frauds, economic penetration, and murder campaigns. They raped and murdered Indonesians in a vicious ferocity that pales the crimes of Hitler. They also walked over the democratically elected and popular leader of Indonesia, Hosni Sukarno, peddling racist propaganda lies through their press that he was a womanizer and sex addict. The angry white vigilantes who are promoters of rape by Suharto, mass rape, and sexual slavery by Suharto against third world peoples dare to accuse a great Indonesian leader of such crimes only points to their pathetic principles and murderous bloodlust against third world ethnic peoples. They also forced the issue against the great Asian and Latin American peoples and used terror and torture as well as genocided technological hardware against the people to enforce American hegemony and run its vicious colonial administration. The white racist American Congress and President Eisenhower, as well as Dulles as Secretary of State, Lyndon Johnson as butcher-in-chief, Richard Nixon and his butcher-in-chief, Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State, Jimmy Carter, butcher-in-chief, and Ronald Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander Haig, co-butchers-in-chief, not to mention only a few, used genocidal white murder, torture, and terror technique type torture and dismemberments with decapitation as the norm in their control of these peoples. All of these programs were made possible because of the complicity of the American mass media frauds, as well as the American academic frauds, who not only remain silent in the presence of such genocidal slaughter put forth by their criminal white American government, but also they proclaimed as in Indonesia, Guy Parker, Rand Corporation, Guatemala, Arthur Kroc, New York Times, that ethnic cleansing and a sweep of the homes is the way to maintain American capitalist controls of these regions and avoid a communist takeover. Also note Samuel Huntington, who stated that the Viet Cong were a powerful force which cannot be dislodged with its consistency, so long as the Vietnamese people continue to exist. Thus, how did we approach Vietnam? How did the white racist, vigilante, angry, savage, bestial butchers of Washington to approach this? Was to basically what the American racist politicians followed Mr. Samuel Huntington's approach, the Department of Government at Harvard chief of staff. They indiscriminately murdered and formed concentration camps in Vietnam to make the Vietnamese people, who were the constituency, cease to exist. So basically a genocide. A Harvard professor called for the genocide against the great Asian and Indonesian peoples again. Another racist, white, anti-third world fraud of American academia. They quashed dissent with assassination and bombing. They forcibly relocated populations to concentration camps. They starved the people and executed the people. And as we can see throughout Latin America, throughout the great third world nations of Latin America, Central America, Asia, and Africa, free speech and free thought were relegated by Washington to the grave. Let us review a few of the actions that the U.S. government did. Jimmy Carter, we discussed, the sadist in chief and American lynch mob vigilante butcher, allowed the white colonial dictatorship of El Salvador and Nicaragua, as well as Guatemala, to mass murder, cause mass starvation of people. And any aid was given in light of the Amnesty International, American Red Cross, and Roman Catholic churches to stop aid to the regimes. These were given despite the calls to stop aid. The racist white American Congress, as well as Mr. Carter, who was a war criminal and abetted Somoza's escape of Nicaragua after the Sandinistas took power using Red Cross planes, continued to funnel aid into these regimes in the billions of dollars. The angry white racist lynch mob, vigilante American bestial savage butchers did not listen to the human rights organizations, but also continued to funnel the money to genocidal professional murderers who were sadistic, cruel, and detached of their crimes and used torturers, as we have discussed previously. The rest of the presidents and their sadistic, cruel, and detached genocidal campaigns of these great third world ethnic peoples of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, who were only seeking sovereignty and independence over their natural resources, which were birthright privileges, and were ripped away by the white racist American frauds and butchers, were discussed completely in Dr. Noam Chomsky's book, Turning the Tide. So that's it. Basically, I just wanted to conclude with that. Those were the closing remarks. I hope you can join me in 2 days. Turning the Tide. Again, the Google link will be provided in the description section. Hope you can join me on Saturday morning. I will have, an additional podcast, chapter 2 of the book, which is basically chapter 2 of the book, patterns of intervention. So again, Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.